Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through a heavy wooden door into a dimmed medieval chamber where candles flicker against stone walls, and you smell beeswax mixed with herbs you can't quite name. A woman's breath comes in rhythmic waves while other women move around her with quiet purpose, their hands busy with tasks that seem half practical, half magical. You're about to witness something that was hidden from most of medieval society, the mysterious, sacred, sometimes bizarre world of childbirth rituals that governed one of life's most dangerous passages. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, about why birth became such a medicalized, male-dominated event in later centuries. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share what you know about old birth traditions in your own family history. I love hearing from you. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You stand in the doorway of a merchant's house in late autumn, somewhere in England around 1340, and you notice immediately that the room feels different. Every window has been shuttered and sealed with heavy fabric, not just closed but deliberately blocked so that no crack of daylight can penetrate. The air is thick and warm, almost stifling, scented with burning herbs, rosemary, perhaps, and something sharper you don't recognize. 3 women move around the central figure, and one of them notices you, gestures for you to enter or leave, but makes it clear you cannot simply observe from the threshold. The space itself has been transformed into something between a sick room and a temple. This is the lying-in chamber, and its preparation followed rules as strict as any religious ceremony. The process began days or even weeks before labour started, when the pregnant woman, if she had the means, would retreat from normal household activities into this specially prepared space. The midwife, already summoned and consulted multiple times throughout the pregnancy, would oversee the transformation. You watch as she checks each window seal, running her weathered fingers along the edges to ensure no drafts can enter. Medieval medical theory held that women's bodies during pregnancy and birth were dangerously open, vulnerable to corrupt air and malevolent influences that could slip through any gap. The sealed chamber wasn't just about privacy or warmth, it was a protective barrier against invisible threats. The darkness serves multiple purposes that interweave medical theory, religious belief, and ancient practice in ways that sometimes contradict each other. According to humoral theory, the dominant medical framework inherited from ancient Greece, women's bodies were naturally cold and moist, and pregnancy made them even more susceptible to imbalance. Cold drafts could introduce harmful vapours that might cause complications, or even cause the womb to wander within the body, a bizarre notion that persisted from classical medicine. At the same time, Christian theology viewed birth as a consequence of Eve's sin, a painful reminder of humanity's fall, and the darkened room echoed both the darkness of the tomb and the darkness before divine creation. Some scholars suggest even older, pre-Christian associations with caves and earth goddesses lingered in these practices, though medieval women would have firmly denied any pagan connections. The walls, you notice, have been hung with fabric or tapestries, even in homes that couldn't normally afford such luxury. Neighbours and family members loaned their best cloths for this purpose, creating a womb-like enclosure. The effect is claustrophobic by modern standards, but to medieval thinking it made perfect sense. Birth happened in darkness because darkness was primal, original, the state before creation. The labouring woman was about to perform an act of creation herself, and the room echoed that cosmic moment. Historians still argue whether this darkness served primarily medical, spiritual, or social purposes, but whatever the intention, it was nearly universal across medieval Europe. Even the poorest households made some effort to darken and enclose the birthing space, hanging whatever fabric they could spare or borrow. You notice the midwife sprinkling something across the threshold salt. You realise, laid in a careful line that no one steps across carelessly, she mutters words you can't quite hear, and you wonder if she's praying or invoking something older than prayer. Above the door frame, someone has hung a small iron horseshoe, and near the bed, you spot scissors in a strange arrangement, half open and positioned just so. These aren't medical tools laid out for use, they're protective objects, positioned according to traditions passed between women for generations. The iron, everyone knew, kept away fairies and malevolent spirits. The salt purified and created boundaries that supernatural beings supposedly couldn't cross. Modern folklorists have traced these protective practices back through centuries, finding remarkably similar traditions across cultures that had little contact with each other, suggesting something deeply rooted in human anxiety about the vulnerability of birth. The bed itself dominates the room, a substantial piece of furniture that represents significant wealth in this era. It's been prepared with layers of linens, and you see that someone has tucked sprigs of herbs between the mattress and the bed frame. St. John's wort, maybe, or vervain plants associated with protection and blessing. The pillows have been arranged not for the woman to lie down, which surprises you, but to support her in a semi-upright position. You're beginning to realise that nearly everything you assume about childbirth from modern experience is about to be challenged. The bed, in fact, might not even be used for the actual delivery. It's more of a command centre, a place for the labouring woman to rest between contractions, a throne of sorts from which she'll direct her own experience with the midwife's guidance. One of the women, not the midwife, but one of the gossips, as they're called, offers the labouring woman a drink from a pewter cup. The liquid is dark and you catch a whiff of honey, wine, and something herbal. These birth drinks were carefully prepared, their recipes guarded and modified by each midwife according to her training and intuition. Some contained harmless herbs like raspberry leaf, which modern herbalists still recommend. Others included ingredients that range from questionable to dangerous powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, pulverized precious stones, or extracts from plants we'd now recognize as mildly toxic. The theory was that strong substances were needed to strengthen the woman for her ordeal, and that rare, expensive ingredients contained more power than common ones. One medieval recipe surviving in manuscript form calls for powdered eagle stone, saffron, and wine blessed by a priest, a combination of geology, botany, and theology that would baffle a modern pharmacist, but made perfect sense in a world where the material and spiritual were thoroughly entangled. You count 6 women in the chamber now, including the midwife. This number wasn't accidental medieval custom prescribed that a respectable birth required the presence of gossips, a word that originally meant god-siblings or spiritual kin, before it acquired its modern meaning through the association of women gathering and talking during these long vigils. These were neighbours, relatives and friends who would witness the birth, support the mother, and later testify to the legitimacy of the child if questions ever arose. In an age without birth certificates or official documentation, these witnesses served a crucial legal function: a child's inheritance, marriage prospects, and entire social standing might one day depend on these women's testimony about the circumstances of the birth. But they also provided practical help. emotional support, and the shared wisdom of women who had themselves survived childbirth, which was, you must remember, genuinely life-threatening, with maternal mortality rates that would horrify us today. The midwife begins to circle the room, and you realise she's checking her preparations one final time. She touches a small bundle hanging near the head of the bed. You'll learn later this contains written prayers or possibly a fragment of a saint's relic. She adjusts a candle, moving it slightly, concerned about the angle of its light or perhaps some symbolic positioning you don't understand. She speaks to the labouring woman in a low, steady voice, asking questions about the contractions, checking the progression of labour with experienced hands, but also weaving in reassurances that blend the practical with the spiritual. The Virgin Mary watches over you. Your body knows what to do. The moon is in a favourable position. Her voice carries an authority that comes from having attended dozens, perhaps hundreds of births, having seen women through this passage successfully, and having witnessed, too, the tragedies that everyone in the room knows are possible but tries not to speak aloud. Someone knocks at the door, and tension immediately fills the room. One of the gossips goes to answer, opening it only a crack. A man's voice filters through the husband, anxious for news. The gossip speaks to him briefly, kindly but firmly, and closes the door. He is not permitted to enter, and won't be until everything is finished and the room has been restored. This is women's territory, women's work, women's mystery. The exclusion of men from the birthing chamber was one of the most strictly observed taboos of medieval life. Crossing all social classes, kings paced in antechambers while their wives laboured, just as peasants did. The birth room was a rare space of female authority in a male-dominated society, and that authority was guarded jealously. You sense that something important happens in this exclusion, not just the practical matter of keeping anxious husbands out of the way, but the creation of a separate realm where women's knowledge passed from one generation to the next, where hierarchies were temporarily suspended, and where the fundamental mystery of new life unfolded according to rules that men neither made nor fully understood. The midwife reaches into a wooden chest near the bedside, and you lean closer to see what she's retrieving. Her fingers close around something wrapped in silk, and she handles it with a reverence usually reserved for the most precious objects. When she unwraps it, you see a thin strip of parchment covered in faded Latin script, mounted on cloth that's been worn soft from repeated use. This is a birth girdle, and the way every woman in the room falls slightly quieter tells you they believe it holds genuine power. The midwife drapes it carefully across the labouring woman's swollen belly, adjusting it so the words face upward, and begins to murmur a prayer. You're witnessing one of medieval Christianity's strangest intersections with childbirth, the use of holy relics and blessed objects as medical intervention. Birth girdles were among the most sought-after aids for labouring women throughout medieval Europe, and the most famous examples were believed to have touched the Virgin Mary herself, or been worn by female saints. The girdle at Westminster Abbey, purportedly St. Mary's own, was so renowned that queens borrowed it for their confinements, and its loan required formal negotiation and substantial payment to the abbey. You try to imagine the logistics messengers dispatched when labour began. The precious relic rushed through city streets in its protective case, all based on the conviction that proximity to Mary's clothing could ease the pains of childbirth and ensure safe delivery. The girdle you're watching now is almost certainly not authentic, probably created by a local monastery, or perhaps even the midwife herself. But that doesn't diminish anyone's faith in its efficacy. The words inscribed on it invoke Mary's name alongside various saints known for protecting women in childbirth, creating what medieval people understood as a spiritual shield. These girdles came in various forms. Some were actual belts or sashes that had supposedly belonged to saints. Others were strips of parchment inscribed with prayers and biblical passages sewn into fabric bands. The text typically included the measurements of Christ's body or the cross, specific psalms thought to have protective power, and invocations of saints like Margaret of Antioch, who according to legend was swallowed by a dragon and emerged unharmed, making her an obvious patron for women hoping to deliver babies safely. Historians still argue whether these objects represented genuine religious devotion, superstition, or a pragmatic blending of both. But their popularity was undeniable. Even women who owned no other valuable possessions often had access to a birth girdle through their church or midwife. The woman in labour grips the girdle with one hand, her knuckles white during a contraction, and you realise it serves a dual-purpose spiritual comfort and something physical to hold on to during pain. The midwife positions her other hand on a small leather pouch hanging from her belt, and when she opens it, you catch a glimpse of what looks like a smooth, dark stone about the size of a walnut. This is an eagle stone, or étites, a geological curiosity that rattles when shaken because it contains loose material inside its hollow centre. Ancient writers claimed eagles carried these stones to their nests to ease egg-laying, and medieval practitioners extrapolated that what helped eagles would surely help women. The stone would be tied to the woman's thigh during labour, then quickly removed after delivery because according to belief leaving it on too long would cause the womb itself to emerge. You watch as another gossip produces a small vial from her sleeve. Holding it up to the candlelight, the liquid inside has a strange, milky quality, and when she announces it's Mary's milk, you realise she means this literally, or at least everyone in the room believes it literally. Churches across Europe claim to possess samples of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, preserved miraculously for over a millennium, available for the faithful to venerate and, in desperate circumstances, to consume. The chemical impossibility of preserved milk lasting centuries didn't occur to medieval believers, or perhaps they understood it as part of the miracle. Modern analysis of these relics has found them to be various substances: powdered limestone, chalk mixed with water, even ground seashells, but in this darkened chamber, the woman drinks a few drops mixed with wine, believing she's receiving divine sustenance that connects her suffering directly to Mary's own experience of motherhood. The collection of holy objects doesn't end there. You notice a small wooden box on a shelf that the midwife treats with particular care. Inside, wrapped in linen, is what she claims is a fragment of the Virgin's veil, though it looks to you like ordinary cloth, perhaps cut from an altar covering or donated by a nun. Near it sits a tiny phial supposedly containing oil from a lamp that burned at a saint's shrine, and a scrap of parchment with a prayer copied in shaky letters by someone barely literate. The cumulative effect is overwhelming. This room has been transformed into a kind of portable shrine, bristling with spiritual defences against the dangers of childbirth. Each object represents not just faith, but also considerable expense and effort. Even the humblest items had to be acquired, blessed, or inherited, woven into a network of belief that connected this single room to churches, monasteries, and pilgrimage sites across Christendom. The obsession with relics reflected medieval Christianity's understanding of how holiness worked. Sacred objects weren't merely symbolic, they were believed to contain actual spiritual power that could affect physical reality. A saint's bone or a thread from Mary's garment carried something of that holy person's essence, their closeness to God, their ability to intercede when applied to the crisis of childbirth. This belief became intensely practical. Women and their families would go to extraordinary lengths to acquire access to powerful relics, seeing them not as supplements to prayer but as concrete tools for survival. The Church both encouraged and regulated this practice, lending prestigious relics for fees that enriched monasteries and cathedrals, while also providing desperate families with hope in an age of appalling maternal and infant mortality. But here's where things get interesting and slightly amusing from a modern perspective. The sheer number of authentic relics circulating through medieval Europe suggests that either Mary had a very extensive wardrobe, or the relic market was, shall we say, creatively supplied. Skeptics even in the medieval period noted that if all the pieces of the true cross were gathered together, they'd build a ship, and if all samples of Mary's milk were collected, they'd fill a lake. Yet demand never diminished. A midwife with a good collection of relics, even dubious ones, enhanced her reputation and could charge higher fees. She became not just a medical attendant, but a spiritual facilitator, someone who could marshal supernatural forces on behalf of her clients. You notice the labouring woman reaching for yet another object, a small scroll that hangs around her neck on a leather cord. When you glimpse it unrolled briefly between contractions, you see it's covered in text that mixes Latin prayers with strange symbols you don't recognise, possibly astrological signs or corrupted Hebrew letters that some scribe thought looked mystical. These were called birth scrolls, or sometimes charms, and they occupied a grey area between approved church practice and forbidden magic. Officially, the Church taught that only genuine relics blessed by proper authority should be used, and that magical charms were sinful. In practice, the line blurred constantly. A prayer written on parchment and blessed by a priest was acceptable. But what if the prayer included the names of angels not mentioned in Scripture? What if it contained words in languages the priest didn't understand? What if someone added symbols alongside the text? The midwife and gossips in this room probably don't worry too much about such distinctions. They're focused on what works, on what tradition is passed down, on what brings comfort and perhaps saves lives. The theological complexity of these practices reveals something fascinating about medieval Christianity. It was far messier, more syncretic, and more pragmatic than we sometimes imagine. The official religion of learned priests and theological treatises existed alongside a folk Christianity that absorbed older traditions, borrowed from Jewish mysticism, experimented with protective formulas, and generally did whatever seemed to help people through life's dangers. Childbirth, being so perilous and so resistant to rational intervention with medieval medical knowledge, became a particular focus for this kind of practical spiritual bricolage. Women facing possible death in labour weren't inclined to worry about fine points of orthodoxy. They wanted everything that might help church-approved relics, questionable charms, herbal remedies, and probably a few practices inherited from pre-Christian grandmothers who'd never set foot in a church. The midwife now produces one final item from her collection, and this one makes even you, a time-travelling observer supposedly hardened to medieval strangeness, pause in wonder. It's a small pouch containing what she claims is dust from a saint's tomb, gathered on pilgrimage years ago. She mixes a pinch of this dust into wine and offers it to the labouring woman, who drinks without hesitation. The idea that consuming holy dust could provide medical benefit seems bizarre, until you remember that medieval people saw no clear boundary between physical and spiritual causation. If sin could cause sickness, and they absolutely believed it could, then holiness could cause healing. The dust from a saint's tomb, where miracles were known to occur, carried some residue of divine power. Mixed with wine and consumed with faith, it became medicine for both body and soul, a treatment that addressed the whole person in a way that medieval medicine, for all its flaws, sometimes grasped better than our own fragmented approach. A sharp knock at the chamber door interrupts the quiet rhythm of prayer and preparation, and one of the gossips moves quickly to answer it. You hear a male voice insistent, worried, asking for news of his wife's condition. The gossip speaks to him through the barely open door, her tone kind but absolutely firm. He cannot enter. He will not enter. Not now. Not during the labour. Not until everything is finished and the room has been aired and restored. The door closes, and you hear his footsteps retreating down the hallway, probably toward the hall where he'll pace and wait with other male relatives, excluded from the most significant event currently happening in his own home. This exclusion wasn't casual or accidental. It was one of the most rigidly enforced rules of medieval childbirth, a boundary that separated male and female spheres with remarkable clarity. The prohibition against men in the birthing chamber crossed all social boundaries in medieval society. Kings waited outside while queens laboured. Noble men, accustomed to authority over every aspect of their households, found themselves barred from their own bedchambers. Peasant husbands, who worked alongside their wives in fields and shared the intimate space of one-room cottages, suddenly faced a door they couldn't cross. The only exceptions were male physicians, and even they could enter only under specific circumstances. Usually when something had gone terribly wrong and the midwife specifically requested help, or when the mother had already died and the physician was being called to attempt surgical extraction of a living child. Under normal circumstances, birth belonged entirely to women, and men simply had no place in that world. The reasons for this exclusion were complex, woven from threads of modesty, medical theory, social custom, and belief about the nature of male and female bodies. Medieval culture was obsessed with female modesty, and childbirth necessarily involved exposure of the most private parts of a woman's body. For a woman to be seen in such a vulnerable, undressed state by any man other than her husband was considered deeply shameful, and even husbands were excluded. Perhaps because the intimacy of marriage wasn't thought to extend to medical or quasi-medical procedures. The midwife and gossips who attended were all women who had themselves given birth. They formed a community of shared experience that men, by biological necessity, could never join. You sense that the women in this room feel a certain pride in this exclusion, a rare area where male authority simply didn't apply and male presence wasn't wanted. Medieval medical theory provided additional justification for keeping men away. The humoral understanding of bodies held that men and women were fundamentally different, men hot and dry, women cold and moist. The process of birth was seen as an intensely feminine, cooling, moistening event, and the presence of male bodies with their heat and dryness might disrupt the natural progression of labour. Some medical texts suggested that male presence could actually inhibit contractions or cause complications through some poorly defined energetic interference. Whether anyone truly believed this, or whether it was simply a convenient rationalization for an existing social custom, historians still debate. What's undeniable is that the exclusion was treated as medically necessary, not just socially preferable. But there's something else happening in this exclusion, something about power and knowledge. You watch the midwife work, checking the progression of labour with experienced hands, reading signs in the woman's body that years of practice have taught her to recognise, making decisions about when to encourage activity and when to suggest rest. this knowledge passed from one generation of women to the next through direct observation and apprenticeship, completely outside the university system that trained male physicians. Universities were closed to women throughout the medieval period, and the medical knowledge taught there was based on ancient texts written by men who had never attended a birth. The practical art of midwifery, by contrast, was empirical, experiential, and entirely female-controlled. The birthing chamber was one of the few spaces where women's expertise trumped men's, where female knowledge was recognised as superior, and that authority was guarded carefully. The legal implications of this separation were also significant, because only women witnessed births. Questions about legitimacy, paternity, or the exact circumstances of delivery could only be answered by female testimony. This gave the gossips present at births considerable legal power. If a child's inheritance was later disputed, if questions arose about whether a baby had been born alive or dead, whether it had shown signs of being full-term or premature, all these matters that could determine property rights and social standing depended on what these women would testify to having seen. The birthing chamber, for all its appearance as a private, domestic space, was actually a site of legal witness-bearing that could have profound public consequences. Men were excluded partly because their presence wasn't needed for this female work of witnessing and validating. The husband you heard at the door might wait for hours, even days, with no updates except what the gossips choose to tell him through the closed door. He has no right to demand entry, no authority to override the midwife's control of the space. If he tried to force his way in, the women would physically bar him, and social opinion would support them entirely. You hear him pacing in another room, perhaps praying, perhaps drinking with male relatives who've come to keep him company in his anxiety. There's something almost comical about it, this man who probably has legal authority over his wife's property, who can make decisions about her life in most circumstances, who is considered her superior in the social and religious hierarchy of medieval society, now reduced to an anxious pacer in his own home, waiting for women to tell him whether his child has been born. Yet his exclusion also spared him from some of the difficult realities of childbirth. He wouldn't see his wife's pain directly, wouldn't witness any complications or emergencies, wouldn't have to make impossible decisions if things went wrong. The separation protected male sensibilities and preserved a certain distance that perhaps made it easier for men to maintain their sense of women as pure, modest, and not quite fully physical. The messiness and danger of birth remained hidden behind closed doors, contained within female space, allowing men to sentimentalize motherhood without confronting its brutal realities. Historians still argue about whether this exclusion of men ultimately empowered or constrained women. On one hand, it created a rare sphere of female autonomy and authority. On the other hand, it kept childbirth marginalized, separated from serious medical study, and ultimately vulnerable to later male medical takeover. The knowledge that passed between midwives wasn't written down in Latin textbooks, wasn't formalized into theory, wasn't taught in institutions. When male physicians eventually began to claim expertise in childbirth, they could dismiss midwifery as mere folk practice, ignorant and superstitious, precisely because it existed outside the official structures of learning that only men could access. For now, though, in this chamber in 1340 the exclusion holds firm. The door remains closed, the husband remains outside. The women's work continues according to its own rhythms and rules. You notice that even the presence of male saints is limited here. The prayers invoke Mary above all. Along with female saints like Margaret and Anne, the spiritual helpers summoned into this space are overwhelmingly female, creating what amounts to a women's religion within Christianity, focused on specifically feminine concerns and led by female intercessors. The birthing chamber becomes, in these hours, a kind of women's church where different rules apply and different voices hold authority. One of the younger gossips, perhaps attending her first birth as a witness, asks the midwife a question about when the baby will come, and the midwife's answer is patient but firm. The child comes in God's time and the body's time, not when men would schedule it. There's a slight edge to her voice, a reminder that this process follows its own logic, resistant to outside control or male impatience. You sense that the exclusion of men isn't just about modesty or medical theory, it's about protecting this unpredictable, uncontrollable process from attempts to rush it, manage it, or impose rational order on something that medieval people understood as fundamentally mysterious and subject to divine will rather than human authority. The door remains firmly closed, the boundary holding strong, as the women settle back into their vigil. Outside, men wait and wonder. Inside, the ancient work of bringing life into the world continues in female hands, following knowledge passed mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, gossip to gossip, in an unbroken chain that stretches back beyond memory, beyond written record, to the very first birth attended by women helping women through humanity's most dangerous passage. The midwife moves to a cloth-wrapped bundle tucked in the corner of the chamber, and when she unwraps it, you see dozens of small pouches, bottles and containers, each carefully labelled or marked with symbols only she can interpret. This is her herbal pharmacy, accumulated over years of practice, traded with other midwives, gathered on woodland walks, and purchased from apothecaries. She selects one pouch and opens it, releasing an earthy, slightly bitter scent into the already herb-thick air. You watch as she crumbles dried leaves into a cup of warm wine, stirring carefully while murmuring, something perhaps measuring by prayer length rather than minutes. A common medieval timing method. The labouring woman will drink this shortly, trusting that whatever the midwife has chosen will ease her pain, speed her labour, or protect her from dangers both physical and supernatural. Mugwort was among the most common herbs employed in medieval childbirth, and you recognise its distinctive feathery leaves as the midwife adds them to her preparation. Medieval herbals praised mugwort extravagantly, claiming it could ease labour pains, speed delivery, and even protect against evil spirits drawn to the vulnerability of birthing women. Modern research suggests mugwort does contain compounds that can stimulate uterine contractions, meaning medieval midwives weren't entirely wrong in their application, though whether the dosage in these wine mixtures was sufficient to have actual physiological effect remains unclear. Historians still argue whether these herbal remedies worked through genuine pharmacological action, placebo effect, or simply the comfort of receiving treatment during a frightening ordeal. The women in this room wouldn't have understood the question in those terms for them. The herb worked, and that was sufficient. The midwife's knowledge of herbs came from multiple sources, creating a medical tradition that blended classical learning, Christian symbolism, and folk wisdom into something uniquely medieval. Some of her information derived ultimately from ancient Greek and Roman texts, filtered through Arabic scholars and translated into Latin, then vernacular languages, then oral tradition. Other remedies came from generations of practical experience, tested by trial and error on countless labouring women. Still others reflected symbolic thinking. Plants with red sap might help with bleeding. Plants that open their flowers might help open the womb. Plants associated with female saints might invoke their protective power. The result was a pharmacopoeia that ranged from genuinely helpful to useless to potentially dangerous, often with no clear way to distinguish which was which. You watch as the midwife prepares a second drink, this one containing what she identifies as Mary's thistle. Though you're not certain which plant she means, several thorny plants carried that name in medieval herbalism. She adds a scraping of what looks like dried root, possibly valerian or perhaps the more exotic and expensive ginger, imported from distant lands and believed to carry the heat needed to warm and strengthen cold. Weakened female bodies during labour, the mixture is sweetened with honey, not just for taste but because honey itself was considered medicinal, associated with preservation and purity. Medieval people believed honey never spoiled, and tombs opened after centuries supposedly contained still edible honey, making it a symbol of eternity and divine preservation appropriate for a moment when life itself hung in balance. But the midwife's arsenal extends beyond plant materials into stranger territory. She retrieves a small item from another pouch, and when you see it clearly, you realise it's a stone worn smooth by handling, roughly oval, with a small hole through its centre. This is a hagstone, also called a holy stone or adder stone, found naturally where water has worn through softer rock. Medieval belief held these stones possessed powerful protective properties hung above beds. They prevented nightmares, worn around the neck. They warded off evil and applied during childbirth. They eased labour and protected both mother and child from malevolent forces. The midwife doesn't apply this stone directly to the woman's body, but rather positions it carefully on the bedside table where its protective influence can radiate. You're witnessing the fuzzy boundary between medicine and magic that characterized so much of medieval healing practice. The eagle stone you noticed earlier makes another appearance now, and the midwife explains its use to one of the younger gossips, passing down knowledge that will make this witness a better helper at future births. The stone should be tied to the left thigh during labour, she explains, because the left side was associated with feminine energy and receptivity in medieval cosmology. The stone's inner rattle was understood as containing smaller stones, just as the mother contained a child, creating a kind of sympathetic magic. The stone's ability to open and reveal its contents would magically encourage the womb to do likewise. After delivery, the stone must be immediately removed and tied to the left arm instead, because its opening power, if left near the womb, might cause hemorrhage or prevent the womb from contracting properly. Whether this made any medical sense was beside the point. The logic was symbolic, and the stone had been used that way for generations. From yet another container, the midwife produces a substance that makes you grimace. Powdered earthworms, she announces, excellent for easing difficult births when mixed with wine. Medieval pharmacology included a startling array of animal ingredients, and earthworms were considered especially valuable because they moved through earth, the element associated with fertility and the feminine. The doctrine of signatures, the belief that God marked useful things with signs of their purpose, suggested that creatures who easily moved through narrow spaces might help babies move through the birth canal. The labouring woman doesn't look thrilled about drinking earthworm powder, but she doesn't refuse either. In an age with desperately limited medical options, you took what help you could get and hoped for the best. The strangest item in the midwife's collection is a small vial of liquid she handles with particular care. When asked, she explains it contains water drawn from a holy well at dawn on St. John's Day. Carried home without speaking a word, breaking silence would nullify the water's power. This water has been blessed by association with a saint's feast day, by the liminality of dawn, and by ritual silence, making it triply powerful. She adds just 3 drops to the labouring woman's drink, counting carefully. The number 3 carried obvious Christian significance: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but also much older magical associations with completion and transformation. Medieval Christianity absorbed and baptized countless pre-Christian practices, and the care taken with this water's collection and use suggests traditions stretching back far beyond the Church's arrival. The midwife also produces what she calls virgin parchment, made from the skin of an animal that died before reaching sexual maturity, considered purer and more powerful than ordinary writing material. On this parchment, a prayer has been written in red ink, and you notice the red was apparently made with actual blood mixed into the pigment, though whether human or animal blood, you prefer not to speculate. The prayer will be burned, and the labouring woman will inhale the smoke, taking the prayer's power directly into her body. This practice occupied a grey area of church approval. Burning prayers as incense seemed acceptably devotional. But the specific materials and the magical thinking behind the practice hinted at older, less orthodox traditions. One of the gossips contributes her own remedy, a small bag of herbs she's brought from home, sewn into a charm that should be worn around the neck. She's less certain of the specific herbs than the midwife, admitting she got the mixture from her own mother, who got it from her mother, in a chain of inheritance that no one can trace to its origin. The bag also contains, she says somewhat sheepishly, a small piece of paper with words written on it, though she admits she can't read what it says. The midwife examines it briefly and recognises it as a corrupted Latin prayer, probably copied by someone who didn't understand the language, passed down until the words are barely recognisable. She approves its use anyway. The intention and tradition matter more than textual accuracy. You're beginning to understand that medieval childbirth remedies existed in a complex ecosystem of belief, where Christian prayer, classical medicine, folk wisdom, and outright magic all coexisted and combined. The midwife saw no contradiction in using blessed relics alongside peculiar stones, in recommending herbal drinks while also arranging protective charms. Each element addressed a different aspect of the danger herbs treated the physical body. Prayers invoked divine protection. Charms and stones warded off supernatural threats. The medieval worldview didn't separate these categories the way modern thinking does. A woman in labour faced physical, spiritual, and magical dangers simultaneously, and her treatment needed to address all three realms at once. The labouring woman drinks the mugwort mixture, grimacing at its bitterness despite the honey and wine meant to mask the taste. She thanks the midwife with genuine faith that this cup contains her best hope for safe delivery. Around her, the gossips offer encouragement, sharing their own birth stories, normalising the pain and fear while also providing the comfort of shared experience. The herbal remedies, whatever their actual efficacy, came wrapped in this social support system that was perhaps the most valuable medicine of all. The assurance that other women had survived this, that knowledge and help were available, that she wasn't alone in her ordeal. The contractions intensify, and the midwife signals to the gossips that active labour is progressing. You notice the atmosphere in the room shifts, conversations quiet, movements become more purposeful, and someone begins to recite prayers in a low, steady rhythm. The prayers aren't random or spontaneous. They follow a specific sequence that the midwife has clearly directed, chosen for this particular phase of labour. You're about to witness how medieval Christianity wove itself into the physical process of childbirth, creating a soundtrack of invocations that accompanied each stage of delivery, turning the birthing chamber into a place where heaven and earth were thought to touch with unusual intimacy. The primary prayer being recited is Psalm 51, the Miserere, one of the Church's great penitential psalms. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness." The gossips murmur in unison, their voices creating a gentle drone beneath the labouring woman's breathing. The choice of this psalm reflects medieval theology's uncomfortable relationship with childbirth. It was simultaneously natural and necessary, yet tainted by association with Eve's sin and the painful consequences of humanity's fall. The woman in labour needed both God's mercy for her sinful condition and his protection through a dangerous ordeal. The psalm addressed both needs, acknowledging unworthiness while pleading for divine compassion. You find it somewhat harsh that women in their most vulnerable moment were encouraged to contemplate their sinfulness. But medieval sensibilities operated differently, and many women apparently found comfort in this framework of sin, suffering, and redemption. The midwife times the recitation carefully, you notice, synchronizing certain verses with the woman's contractions. As pain peaks, the gossips speak louder, their voices rising to carry the labouring woman through the worst moments. Between contractions, the prayers soften to a murmur, allowing her to rest. This rhythmic prayer serves multiple purposes. It provides distraction from pain, creates a meditative focus, and establishes a communal activity that makes everyone in the room active participants rather than passive witnesses. The prayers also serve to mark time in an era before accurate clocks were common. Experienced midwives knew approximately how long certain prayers took to recite and could gauge labour's progress partly by counting prayer cycles. But the prayers extend beyond psalms into more specifically targeted invocations. The midwife begins to call upon saints by name, and you recognise the litany of female holy figures associated with childbirth protection. Saint Margaret, who emerged whole from the dragon's belly, protect this woman in her travail. Saint Margaret's legend made her the preeminent patron of childbirth. She'd been swallowed by Satan in dragon form during her martyrdom, and the beast burst open, releasing her unharmed. The parallel to a child emerging from the womb was obvious, and Margaret's intercession was sought at thousands of medieval births. Some women laboured while holding manuscripts containing Margaret's story, illustrated with vivid images of the saints standing triumphant over the defeated dragon, a visual promise that emergence and survival were possible. Another gossip takes up the invocation of Saint Anne, the Virgin Mary's mother and thus the grandmother of Jesus. Anne's own story, as told in medieval legend, included years of barrenness before miraculously conceiving Mary in her old age. This made her a powerful intercessor for women struggling with fertility, but also a sympathetic figure of the general trials of motherhood. Holy Anne, who bore the Mother of God, guide this birth and grant safe delivery. The prayer continues, weaving Anne's successful motherhood into a plea for similar success in this room. The invocation of Mary's mother created a chain of maternal connection and to Mary to this struggling woman, suggesting that the pains of childbirth created a universal sisterhood, stretching from earth to heaven. The name of the Virgin Mary herself threads through every prayer, sometimes as direct invocation, sometimes as mere mention, but always present. Holy Mary, Mother of God, you who knew the pains of childbirth, intercede for us. This reference to Mary experiencing labour pains was actually somewhat theologically controversial. Some medieval theologians argued that Mary's sinlessness meant she gave birth without pain, spared Eve's curse. Others insisted she experienced normal labour to fully share in human suffering. The women in this birthing chamber clearly sided with the second interpretation, finding comfort in a Mary who understood their agony from personal experience. A goddess like Mary who floated above physical suffering was less useful than a Mary who had sweated and strained and feared, just as they did now. The midwife produces a small prayer book, its pages worn soft from handling, and begins to read specific verses in Latin. Her Latin is rough, strongly accented, missing the polish of clerical training but adequate to the purpose. She's reading from the Gospel of John, the passage about Jesus' birth, but also mixing in portions of Luke's nativity account. Medieval practice often combined gospel passages freely, creating composite texts optimized for specific purposes rather than adhering to biblical accuracy. The important thing was invoking the power of Scripture, of holy words that had been spoken at the births of saints and could now sanctify this ordinary birth. Between the formal prayers, you hear the midwife murmuring other words, and when you listen carefully, you realize she's speaking charms that aren't quite prayers, formulations that blend Christian and older elements into something the Church would likely have frowned upon if examined too closely. As Christ was born without breaking his mother's seal, so let this child be born without tearing the mother's flesh. The theological premise is dubious. The idea of Mary's perpetual virginity didn't mean Christ's birth involved no physical passage, but the magical thinking is clear. Christ's miraculous birth could serve as a template, a precedent that might shape this ordinary birth through sympathetic magic wrapped in Christian language. Another charm follows, this one invoking the three Marys who attended Christ's tomb on Easter morning. As the three Marys found the tomb open and empty, the stone rolled away. So let this womb open easily and the child emerge safely. You're witnessing how medieval Christianity's rich narrative tradition provided endless material for birth charms any story involving opening, emergence, or transformation could be repurposed as a prayer spell for labour. The line between orthodox prayer and magical incantation was perpetually blurred, and the women in this room navigated it pragmatically, using whatever formulations had proven effective in previous births. Historians still argue about how church authorities felt about these practices. Officially, the church distinguished between legitimate prayers to saints and superstitious charms. In practice, parish priests often knew their female parishioners used borderline magical formulations during childbirth and generally looked the other way. Birth was dangerous enough that few religious authorities wanted to strip away any source of comfort or protection, even if it didn't quite conform to theological standards. The midwife operated in a space of female religious practice that existed somewhat independent of clerical oversight, and as long as she didn't explicitly invoke demons or deny core Christian doctrines, her creative adaptations of prayer were tolerated. The rhythm of prayer creates a kind of trance state in the room, and you notice the labouring woman's breathing has synchronized with the chanting, whether this provides genuine pain relief through some meditative mechanism or simply gives her something to focus on besides the contractions. The effect seems real. Her face, tense and frightened earlier, shows more calm now, even as the labour intensifies. The communal nature of the prayer matters too. She's not suffering alone, but held in a web of voices, all calling on supernatural help on her behalf, all asserting through repeated words that divine protection surrounds her. The prayers also served a witnessing function. You realize, by invoking saints and gospel narratives and by speaking holy words over the birth, the women were sanctifying the event, claiming it for Christianity, asserting that this moment belonged within the story of salvation rather than outside it. Birth was messy, painful, dangerous, and tied to sexuality in ways that made medieval Christianity uncomfortable. The prayers domesticated it, brought it into the religious fold, made it a proper occasion for holy invocation rather than something shameful that happened in darkness. The women reciting these prayers were theologians in their own right, crafting a feminine Christianity that honoured their experiences and needs, even if it never appeared in university lectures or cathedral sermons. As another contraction builds, all the voices rise together. Saint Margaret, pray for us. Saint Anne, pray for us. Holy Mary, Mother of God, Pray for us now and at the hour of our death. The final phrase sounds jarring in a childbirth prayer until you remember that this might indeed be the hour of death for mother or child or both. The prayer acknowledges that reality without flinching, asking for intercession precisely because the danger is real and the outcome uncertain. Medieval people didn't sentimentalize birth or pretend it was safe. They faced its dangers head-on and marshalled every spiritual resource they could imagine: psalms and saints, gospel passages and charms, orthodox prayers and borderline magic, hoping that somewhere in that accumulated invocation, heaven would hear and respond with mercy. The midwife herself commands the room now with an authority that transcends her ordinary social status. You notice how even the wealthier gossips, women who in other contexts would outrank her considerably, defer to her judgments and follow her instructions without question. In this chamber, surrounded by the mysteries of birth, the midwife becomes something more than a hired attendant. She's priestess, physician, and guardian all at once, wielding knowledge that spans the practical and the supernatural, the medical and the magical. Her role in medieval society was unique, paradoxical, powerful yet precarious, and watching her work reveals the complex position women healers occupied in a world that simultaneously depended on them and distrusted them. The training that brought this midwife to her current expertise followed no standardized curriculum, no university program, no official certification process. Instead, she learned through apprenticeship, observation, and hard experience, probably beginning as a young woman attending births with her mother or another female relative, gradually taking on more responsibility as she demonstrated aptitude and nerve. She would have witnessed dozens of births before attending one independently, absorbing not just technical knowledge about labour stages and potential complications, but also the vast repertoire of prayers, charms, herbal remedies, and ritual practices that comprised medieval midwifery. This oral tradition of learning meant that each midwife's practice reflected the specific knowledge chain she'd inherited, creating regional and even individual variations in technique and belief. You watch as she examines the labouring woman with practised hands, her touch both gentle and confident, checking the baby's position with an expertise that required no medical instruments or theoretical frameworks, just years of tactile experience. She knows what normal feels like, and therefore can recognise abnormal, can sense when labour is progressing properly or when something dangerous might be developing. This embodied knowledge, gained through repeated practice rather than book learning, was precisely the kind of expertise that university-trained male physicians would later dismiss as mere intuition or ignorance, unable or unwilling to recognise that it constituted genuine medical skill. The midwife couldn't explain her knowledge in terms of anatomy texts or humoral theory, but she could deliver babies successfully, which ultimately mattered more than theoretical understanding. Her social position in the community was complex and contradictory. On one hand, she was essential and respected. Every woman would likely need her services at some point, and her skill could mean the difference between life and death. Successful midwives built reputations that brought them steady work and decent income, at least by medieval standards. Some became quite prosperous, leaving wills that mentioned substantial property and possessions. The midwife also held unusual authority to enter homes at all hours, to command the activities in birthing chambers, to make urgent decisions without male oversight, and to possess knowledge that men lacked. This created a rare space of female power and autonomy in otherwise male-dominated medieval society. But on the other hand, the midwife's position was vulnerable and sometimes dangerous. Her work involved life and death, and when deaths occurred, as they frequently did, given medieval medical limitations, she might face blame. If a mother or baby died, had the midwife made an error? Or had she failed to use the right prayers? Or had she perhaps brought bad luck or even malevolent magic to the birth? The line between healer and witch was perilously thin, and midwives often found themselves suspected of supernatural mischief, especially when births went tragically wrong. Some witch trial records from later periods show midwives among the accused, their intimate knowledge of female bodies and their mysterious practices making them targets when communities sought scapegoats for misfortune. The church had an ambivalent relationship with midwives, needing their services but worrying about their independence and their semi-magical practices. Church authorities attempted to regulate midwifery through licensing requirements in some regions, demanding that midwives swear oaths promising not to use sorcery, not to perform abortions, and to properly baptize babies in danger of death. This last requirement was particularly important. Midwives were among the few lay people, and the only women, authorized to perform emergency baptism when a baby emerged too weak to survive the wait for a priest. This gave midwives a kind of sacramental authority that made church leaders nervous even as they recognized its necessity. Historians still argue about whether these licensing requirements effectively controlled midwifery practice, or whether most midwives simply continued working as they always had, with or without official approval. You notice the midwife wearing a small badge or token on her dress, and when you look closer, you see it bears a religious symbol, perhaps proving she's taken the church's oath, or simply displaying her piety as protection against accusation. Her reputation depended partly on successful outcomes, but also on being seen as morally upright and religiously orthodox. A midwife known for loose morals or suspected of heretical beliefs would lose clients regardless of her technical skill, because birth was understood as a spiritual event as much as a physical one. The midwife needed to be not just competent, but also respectable, a difficult balance when her work required her to possess forbidden knowledge and exercise unusual authority. The knowledge she possessed included some genuinely helpful medical understanding developed through empirical observation. She knows, for instance, that certain presentations feet first, face up, make birth more difficult and dangerous. She can sometimes manipulate a baby's position externally, trying to turn it into a more favourable configuration. She recognises signs of hemorrhage, infection, and other complications, even if she lacks the vocabulary to name them according to medical theory. She knows herbal remedies that genuinely can stimulate contractions or ease pain, even if she also uses herbs that do nothing or potentially cause harm. Her practice mixed real medical skill with ineffective rituals, but so did university-trained physicians' practice. And arguably the midwife's hands-on experience gave her some practical advantages over doctors who had studied Galen but never actually delivered a baby. Yet she also trafficked in supernatural explanations and interventions that modern medicine would reject entirely. She believes, or at least acts as though she believes, that evil spirits threaten labouring women, that phases of the moon affect birth outcomes, that certain charms and prayers hold genuine power to change physical reality. When you watch her work, you can't always tell which of her actions stem from medical reasoning and which from magical thinking, because she herself probably doesn't make that distinction. For her, an herbal remedy, a protective charm, and a prayer to St. Margaret are all legitimate interventions, different tools for addressing different aspects of the same crisis. The medieval worldview didn't separate natural and supernatural causation the way modern thinking does. So the midwife's integrated approach made perfect sense within her intellectual framework. The gossips watching her work are learning, consciously or not, absorbing the knowledge that makes midwifery a tradition rather than just individual expertise. The younger women present will remember what they see here, which prayers the midwife used and when, how she positioned the labouring woman, what she did when complications arose. Some of these young witnesses might eventually become midwives themselves, carrying forward the techniques and beliefs they observed tonight. This informal system of knowledge transmission worked remarkably well for maintaining practical skills, but it also meant that errors and superstitions got passed along just as readily as useful knowledge. With no mechanism for systematic evaluation or improvement, you notice something else about the midwife's authority. It's temporary and context-specific. In this birthing chamber, she rules absolutely. But once the birth ends and she steps back into ordinary life, she reverts to her normal, modest social status. She can command a merchant's wife during labour, but would show deference to that same woman in the marketplace the next day. Her power is situational, tied to this liminal moment when life hangs in balance and normal social hierarchies briefly suspend in favour of expertise and experience. It's a glimpse of how medieval society could be more flexible and pragmatic than its rigid official hierarchies suggest when survival was at stake. Competence trumped status, at least temporarily. The midwife's supernatural authority rested partly on her association with the boundary between life and death. She presided over moments when souls entered the world, when women might die and need spiritual preparation, when emergency baptism might send an infant soul to heaven rather than limbo. She dealt routinely with blood, with intimate female bodily processes, with the mysterious transformations of pregnancy and birth. All of this gave her a kind of liminal, almost shamanic status, not quite ordinary, not quite holy, existing in the spaces between categories that medieval culture otherwise kept carefully separated. People both needed her and feared her, sought her help and worried about her power, respected her skill and suspected her motives. She walked a knife's edge between honoured healer and dangerous outsider, and that precarious position shaped every aspect of how she practiced her craft. The midwife signals that the moment is approaching, and the room transforms again as the gossips help the labouring woman move from the bed. You expected her to lie down for a delivery, influenced by modern hospital images. But instead you watch as she guided to a sturdy wooden birthing stool positioned near the hearth. The stool is low, shaped like a horseshoe with an open front and carved handles on either side, well worn from previous use. The woman lowers herself onto it with help, gripping the handles, her body upright and leaning slightly forward. Two gossips position themselves on either side to support her, while the midwife kneels before her, ready to receive the baby. This is how most medieval women gave birth upright, squatting or semi-seated, and you're witnessing a practice as old as humanity itself, soon to be overturned by medical fashion. The use of birthing stools was nearly universal across medieval Europe. Though the specific designs varied by region and social class, wealthy households might own elaborate stools with carved decorations and cushioned seats, sometimes family heirlooms passed from mother to daughter. Poorer women might squat over a simple wooden frame or even a pile of straw arranged to provide support. The midwife often brought her own stool as part of her professional equipment, and a well-made birthing stool was a significant investment that marked her as established in her trade. The stool you're observing has seen years of use, its handles smoothed by countless gripping hands, its seat stained despite regular cleaning, bearing silent witness to the births it has facilitated. The physiological advantages of upright birthing positions were understood through experience rather than anatomical theory. Medieval midwives knew that gravity helped during delivery, that women could push more effectively when upright, and that squatting or sitting opened the pelvis more than lying flat. Modern obstetrics has rediscovered these benefits after spending centuries insisting women should give birth lying down, a position that's convenient for attending physicians but actually works against the mechanics of birth. The medieval practice, developed through empirical observation across generations, was in this respect superior to what replaced it. Women's bodies knew how to give birth, and midwives facilitated rather than obstructed that knowledge. But the choice of position involved more than just mechanical efficiency. The birthing stool held symbolic significance, transforming labour into a kind of throne sitting, elevating the labouring woman literally and figuratively. She sat in state while others attended her, a reversal of normal service relationships. The stool also created a ritual space, its distinctive shape, its dedicated purpose. Its positioning in the room all marked this as the sacred centre where transformation would occur. Some birthing stools were decorated with protective symbols or carved with prayers, becoming quasi-magical objects whose power derived partly from their accumulated history of successful births. To sit on a stool that had served your mother and grandmother created a connection across generations, a reassurance that other women in your family had survived this ordeal on this very seat. Historians still argue about regional variations in birth positioning. Some evidence suggests women in certain areas preferred kneeling positions, supported by cushions or held up by gossips. Others use special birth chairs with adjustable backs, allowing varied positions as labour progressed. Ropes hanging from ceiling beams appear in some accounts, with women pulling on them while squatting. The medieval approach to birth positioning was actually quite flexible and responsive to individual women's preferences and the specific circumstances of each labour. The rigid standardization of position came later, when male physicians began insisting on recumbent positions that gave them better access but ignored centuries of accumulated female knowledge. You watch as the labouring woman shifts her weight, seeking the most comfortable configuration, and the gossips adjust their support immediately. Responding to her needs, one holds her from behind, allowing her to lean back during contractions. Another offers her hand for gripping during the most intense moments. The midwife encourages her to rock slightly, to move with the contractions rather than fighting them. This active, responsive approach to positioning reflects a fundamental difference in birth philosophy. Medieval midwives saw their role as helping women do what their bodies already knew how to do, rather than managing birth as a medical procedure requiring strict control. The moment when physicians began recommending recumbent birth positions, women lying on their backs marked a crucial shift in childbirth history. The change began in France in the 17th century and spread gradually through Europe, initially only among the wealthy who could afford physician-attended births. The stated rationale was that lying down gave physicians better access and visibility for their newly developed instruments like forceps. Some historians suggest less professional motives. Reclining positions made women more passive and helpless, more dependent on physician intervention, reinforcing male medical authority over a process that had previously belonged to women. The position was convenient for doctors but disadvantageous for mothers, requiring them to push against gravity and limiting their ability to participate actively in their own deliveries. But in this room in 1340, such medical takeover is still centuries away. The woman on the birthing stool retains control of her body and her labour. She pushes when she feels the urge, rests when she needs to, moves and shifts according to her instincts. The midwife offers guidance and encouragement, but doesn't command or control. Listen to your body, the midwife says. It knows the way. This trust in women's embodied knowledge, in the wisdom of bodies that had evolved to give birth over millions of years, would eventually be dismissed as ignorance by male physicians, confident that their theoretical training surpassed practical experience. The gossips supporting the labouring woman share their own memories as encouragement. I pushed for hours with my first. One says, "You're doing well, better than I did." Another adds, "Remember to breathe deep between contractions. Save your strength for pushing." This collective female knowledge, transmitted through birth stories and direct support, constituted a kind of informal medical education that every woman received. By attending other women's births, you learned what to expect for your own. By hearing birth stories, you absorbed coping strategies and realistic expectations. The birthing chamber was simultaneously a medical event and an educational opportunity, perpetuating practical knowledge that benefited entire communities. You notice the midwife has positioned several items within easy-reach clean linens for receiving the baby, a sharp knife for cutting the umbilical cord, bowls of water, more herbal preparations, and that eagle stone ready to be removed from the woman's thigh as soon as the baby emerges. Her preparations reveal both medical sense and magical thinking. The clean linens and water suggest understanding of cleanliness and infection risk, even if medieval people lacked germ theory to explain why these precautions mattered. The eagle stone and the timing of its removal reflect pure sympathetic magic. Yet removing it involved no harm and possibly provided psychological benefit through the confidence it inspired. The debate over birth positions would rage for centuries after this night, with traditional midwives defending upright positions while physicians promoted recumbent ones. Medical literature published in the 18th and 19th centuries shows physicians arguing that horizontal positions were more civilized and refined, implying that squatting or sitting was animalistic or primitive. This rhetoric reveals the class and gender dynamics underlying the controversy. Male professionals from elite backgrounds presuming to know better than working women whose accumulated experience spanned generations. The fact that modern obstetrics has now largely acknowledged the benefits of upright positioning represents a partial vindication of medieval midwifery, though one that came far too late for millions of women forced to labour in positions that hindered rather than helped. For now, on this birthing stool, the labouring woman bears down with a groan that fills the chamber, and the midwife murmurs encouragement. "I see the head. Just a bit more. You're almost there." The moment of birth approaches, guided by ancient practices and female wisdom, in a position that honours rather than fights the body's own design. The woman grips the handles carved smooth by the hands of countless mothers before her, and pushes her child toward the light. Between contractions, you notice the midwife glancing repeatedly toward the threshold where she laid that careful line of salt earlier. Her attention isn't focused solely on the physical progression of labour. She's also maintaining vigilance against invisible threats that medieval belief held were especially dangerous during childbirth. The hours of labour represented a time of profound vulnerability, when the boundaries between worlds supposedly thinned and malevolent forces could slip through. You're about to witness the elaborate system of protective measures that medieval people employed to guard birthing mothers and newborns from supernatural attack. A complex network of defences that reveals how thoroughly the spiritual and physical intertwined in medieval consciousness. The salt line across the threshold was just the beginning. You notice now, looking more carefully around the chamber, that protective symbols and objects are positioned throughout the space with what appears to be systematic intention. Above each window, though they're shuttered and sealed, someone has traced a cross with blessed water, or perhaps chalk, invisible to casual observation but understood by everyone present as creating a barrier against evil. The open scissors you noticed earlier are positioned points outward near the bed, their iron composition and sharp edges thought to repel fairies and demons who allegedly fled from both metal and the threat of cutting. Medieval folklore held that supernatural beings were strangely vulnerable to human implements of cutting and crafting, as though our ability to shape the physical world gave us weapons against immaterial threats. The midwife reaches up to touch an object hanging from the ceiling beam, directly above where the birthing stool sits. And you see it's a bundle of rowan branches tied with red thread. Rowan trees held powerful protective associations in folk tradition across Europe. Their wood and berries believed to ward off malevolent magic. The red thread added another layer of protection. Red was the colour of blood, of life, and of the sacred. And threads dyed red were thought to carry special potency against evil. This particular charm blended pre-Christian tree lore with Christian symbolism. Some people claimed rowan's protective power derived from the cross being made of rowan wood, though no biblical source supported this, suggesting it was a later rationalization of older beliefs that Christianity had absorbed and baptized. One of the gossips sprinkles something around the birthing stool that releases a sharp, pungent smell. You recognize it as garlic, hung in braids near many medieval homes and considered powerfully protective. Garlic repelled not just vampires, as later folklore would have it, but a whole catalogue of malevolent beings, demons, witches, the evil eye, and various spirits of disease. Its strong smell was thought to be spiritually as well as physically repellent, creating a barrier that evil couldn't cross. Modern science has discovered garlic's genuine antibacterial properties, suggesting medieval people weren't entirely wrong about its protective power, even if they misunderstood the mechanism. The garlic around the birthing stool might actually have provided some protection against infection, though that benefit was entirely accidental from the medieval perspective. The midwife also positions pieces of iron around the birthing area with obvious deliberation. Besides the scissors, you spot an iron horseshoe propped against the wall, an iron key hung on a nail, and what looks like an old knife blade tucked partially under a cushion. Iron held special significance in medieval protective magic. It was the metal of tools and weapons, of human mastery over nature, and supposedly no fairy or demon could tolerate its touch. The association of iron with protection predated Christianity by centuries, reaching back to ancient beliefs about the sacred and dangerous power of metalworking. When a woman sat on the birthing stool surrounded by strategically placed iron implements, she sat within a defensive perimeter as carefully planned as any castle's fortifications. But the threats these defences addressed were frighteningly specific in medieval imagination. Birth drew demons like blood drew flies, or so people believed, because the moment of birth offered rare opportunities for evil. A demon might try to steal the baby, replacing it with a changeling, a demonic impostor who would grow up sickly and strange. A cruel joke at the parents' expense. Alternatively, demons might simply attack to cause death or injury, motivated by hatred of humanity and delight in suffering. The detailed folklore about changelings reveals profound medieval anxiety about infant health and development. Any child who was ill, disabled, or simply difficult might be suspected of being a changeling rather than the real baby. A belief that must have caused terrible suffering for vulnerable families. Fairies represented another category of threat, similar to demons but distinct in some traditions. Medieval and early modern fairy lore portrayed them not as the tiny, benign creatures of later children's stories, but as dangerous, capricious beings of human size or larger, who stole babies out of spite or desire for human servants in their underground kingdoms. Unbaptized babies were supposedly especially vulnerable, lacking the spiritual protection that the sacrament conferred. This belief put tremendous pressure on new parents to arrange baptism immediately, sometimes within hours of birth, and gave midwives their emergency baptism authority. Better a hasty, improper baptism than no baptism at all, if the baby seemed unlikely to survive long enough to reach a church. The evil eye, the belief that certain people could cause harm through envious or malicious gazing, also threatened newborns particularly. A neighbour who felt jealous of a successful birth might inadvertently or deliberately cast the evil eye on mother or child, causing illness or death. This belief created tremendous social pressure to hide births and newborns from public view, to deflect compliments or good wishes that might mask envy, and to employ protective measures against visual contamination. The darkened, sealed birthing chamber served partly to keep the evil eye out, making the birth invisible to potentially hostile gazes. When visitors did come to see mother and baby after birth, elaborate social rituals governed the visit, including specific phrases that had to be spoken to ward off any evil that might accompany even well-intentioned attention. Historians still argue about how literally medieval people believed in these supernatural threats. Some scholars suggest the protective practices were mostly superstitious habits, continued from tradition without deep conviction. Others argue that belief in demons, fairies, and malevolent magic was genuinely widespread and deeply felt, a real source of anxiety that shaped behaviour. The truth probably varied by individual, region, education level, and personal experience. What's undeniable is that the practices were nearly universal. Even educated people who might privately doubt participated in protective rituals, either from social pressure, cautious hedging of bets, or recognition that belief's psychological benefits might help, even if the supernatural threats weren't real. You watch as the midwife completes a circuit of the room, checking each protective element, muttering prayers or charms under her breath. She's not just attending a medical event, she's maintaining a defensive perimeter against an invisible siege. The labouring woman and her baby exist in a bubble of protective magic, ringed by salt and iron, guarded by prayers and holy relics, defended by herbs and charms. The elaborate nature of these defences reveals how terrifying birth was in medieval consciousness. Women didn't just fear the very real physical dangers of hemorrhage, infection, and obstructed labour, they also feared an entire invisible world of malevolent entities allegedly drawn to birth's vulnerability, like predators to wounded prey. The belief in supernatural threats served some psychological functions that might have been adaptive. It gave people a framework for understanding why birth sometimes went tragically wrong despite everyone's best efforts. If a baby died or a mother developed fever and perished, attributing it to demonic attack or fairy malice was somehow more bearable than accepting it as random misfortune or medical failure. The elaborate protective measures gave people a sense of control, a feeling they was doing something effective against dangers that were otherwise unpredictable and uncontrollable. Whether the threats were real or not, the defences provided genuine comfort, and the ritual of checking and maintaining them gave fearful people purposeful activity during tense waiting. Modern medicine would eventually dismiss all of this as pure superstition, the ignorant practices of an unenlightened age. Yet there's something poignant about the care taken, the systematic attention to defence, the conviction that mother and child deserved every possible protection, physical and spiritual. These women believed the universe contained active evil that threatened the innocent, and they responded not with passive acceptance but with elaborate countermeasures drawn from every tradition available to them. They used what tools they had: salt, iron, herbs, prayers, symbols to create safety in a dangerous world. That their metaphysics was mistaken doesn't diminish the courage or devotion behind their efforts. The baby finally emerges with a rush of fluid and a thin, gasping cry that fills the chamber with relief so palpable you can almost touch it. The midwife receives the infant in clean linen, her movements quick and practiced, checking immediately that the baby breathes properly, has the proper number of fingers and toes, and shows no obvious deformities. The mother slumps back against the supporting gossips, exhausted but alive, having crossed the threshold that claimed so many women's lives. But the drama isn't finished, not by far. What happens in the next few weeks will be almost as carefully ritualized as the birth itself. And you're about to witness how medieval society managed the dangerous transition from pregnancy back to normal life. A process that required its own elaborate ceremony called churching. For now, immediate concerns dominate. The midwife ties and cuts the umbilical cord, murmuring prayers as she does so this moment of separation, when the child becomes physically independent from the mother, carried its own spiritual significance. Some midwives saved a portion of the cord or placed it carefully aside for later ritual disposal, believing its treatment could affect the child's future. The afterbirth must still be delivered, and the midwife turns her attention back to the mother, massaging her abdomen, encouraging her to push once more to expel the placenta. This second birth was considered crucial. Retained placenta could cause deadly infection or hemorrhage, and the midwife's knowledge of how long to wait, when to intervene, and what techniques to use meant the difference between survival and disaster. Meanwhile, one of the gossips has taken the baby to the hearth where water has been kept warm. You watch as she carefully bathes the infant, washing away the vernix and blood. Then, and this surprises you, she begins to salt the baby, rubbing salt into the skin all over its tiny body. This practice, mentioned in biblical passages and continued throughout medieval times, supposedly tightened and strengthened the skin, protected against disease, and provided spiritual cleansing. The baby wails at this treatment, its cries echoing off the stone walls, but the gossips continue methodically, believing they're providing essential protection. Modern medicine would recognize the salt as potentially irritating, but probably not seriously harmful, and in an age before antibacterial soap, it might actually have provided some antiseptic benefit, though that was entirely accidental to the intended purpose. After the salt treatment, the baby is swaddled, not loosely wrapped, but bound tightly in long cloth strips that immobilize its limbs completely. Medieval swaddling was comprehensive, creating what looks almost like a tiny mummy, with only the face exposed. The theory held that babies' limbs were soft and malleable, needing external support to grow straight rather than becoming bent or deformed. Infants would remain swaddled almost constantly for months, unwrapped only for cleaning and changing. Modern parenting has mostly abandoned this degree of restriction, though swaddling has seen periodic revivals in gentler forms. You watch the gossip work, her hands sure from having swaddled her own children and probably assisted with dozens of births, creating a neat, firm bundle that the baby, after initial protest, seems to find calming. But the mother's ordeal isn't truly over with the baby's birth, it's merely entering a new phase. Medieval belief held that childbirth left women in a state of spiritual pollution or contamination that required purification before they could rejoin normal society. The concept had roots in Old Testament purity laws from Leviticus, which specified that women who had given birth were ritually unclean for a period of days and couldn't enter the temple or touch holy things until properly purified. Christianity inherited this framework, though with modifications and varying interpretations. The result was the churching ceremony, a ritual purification that women underwent after childbirth before they could return to church, leave their homes freely, or resume marital relations. The lying-in period typically lasted about a month, during which the new mother remained largely confined to her home. often to the darkened birthing chamber or her bedroom. During these weeks, she was exempt from normal household duties, attended by the gossips who'd witnessed the birth and by female relatives. This enforced rest period probably had genuine health benefits, allowing recovery from birth trauma, reducing infection risk by limiting exposure, and giving the mother time to establish nursing. But it also reflected the belief that she remained spiritually dangerous or vulnerable, not yet fully returned from the liminal space of birth, still partway between life and death, still contaminated by the blood and physicality of delivery. During this seclusion, the new mother couldn't attend church services, couldn't prepare food for her family, couldn't have sexual relations with her husband, and in some interpretations, couldn't even leave her house or chamber. She existed in a kind of social quarantine, separated from normal life by an invisible barrier of ritual impurity. Other women could visit and help her, but male visitors were generally discouraged or forbidden. The husband who'd been excluded from the birth remained largely excluded from the aftermath as well. His wife temporarily removed from his authority and dwelling in a women's world of recovery and infant care. Historians still argue about how to interpret churching. Was it primarily about female pollution and control, or primarily about protection and honouring the dangers women had survived? The ceremony's meanings were complex and probably varied by context and individual perception. On one hand, being labelled unclean after fulfilling the essential female role of reproduction seems insulting and oppressive, reinforcing ideas that women's bodies and functions were somehow shameful or dangerous. On the other hand, churching gave women a formal recognition of their ordeal, a public acknowledgement that they had survived something genuinely perilous, and a ritual reintegration into the community with special honour. The month of lying in, while restrictive, also provided rest and female solidarity at a vulnerable time. The churching ceremony itself would eventually take place at the church door, not inside the church initially, emphasizing the woman's not yet fully purified status. The new mother would arrive dressed in her best clothes, often wearing a white veil that symbolized both purity and her special status. She would be met by the priest, who would recite prayers and psalms, sprinkle her with holy water, and lead her into the church while she held a lit candle. The ceremony drew explicitly on Mary's own purification at the temple 40 days after Jesus' birth, an event commemorated in the Feast of Candlemas. By reenacting Mary's purification, every woman connected her own experience to the sacred story, claiming a place in salvation history through the shared experience of motherhood. The candle the woman carried was often specially made or purchased for the occasion, and many women kept their churching candles afterward as treasured possessions. These candles might be lit during subsequent labours for protection, or saved to be buried with a woman when she eventually died, linking her churching her survival of birth to her final passage from life to death. The symbolism was rich. The candle represented the light of life she had brought into the world, the light of Christ guiding her back to full communion with the church, and the light that would eventually guide her soul to heaven. You imagine this new mother in a few weeks' time, preparing for her churching, being dressed by her gossips in fine clothes, walking to church surrounded by the women who had attended her birth, presenting herself at the church door for ritual purification and reintegration. The ceremony would mark the end of her lying-in period, her return to normal life, her resumption of wifely duties and household responsibilities. It would also be a kind of triumph she'd survived childbirth, that most dangerous of passages, and was now being formally welcomed back to the community as a mother, having fulfilled her most essential social role successfully. For now, though, in this chamber with the smell of birth still fresh, the immediate crisis has passed. Mother and baby both live, both seem healthy, and the gossips are beginning the clean-up that will restore the room to normal use. The darkened chamber will eventually be opened and aired. The birthing stool will be wiped clean and stored away. The protective salt and iron will be removed. The herbs cleared out. The extraordinary made ordinary again. But for a month, the mother will remain in her twilight state, neither fully in the world nor fully out of it, waiting for the church to officially purify her and declare her fit to rejoin ordinary life once more. Several rooms away from the common birthing chamber you've been observing, an entirely different scene unfolds in a royal palace. You find yourself in an enormous bedchamber hung with the richest tapestries, lit by dozens of candles in silver holders, crowded with people, far too many people for what's about to happen. A queen lies in the massive state bed, her labour progressing. But unlike the merchant's wife you observed earlier, she has no privacy whatsoever. Courtiers line the walls, officials clutch documents, witnesses crowd near the bed, and everyone watches with intense attention because this birth isn't just a personal matter, it's an affair of state with implications for succession, legitimacy, and political stability. You're about to witness how royal and noble births transform the intimate into the public, the natural into the ceremonial, in ways that must have made the experience even more terrifying than it already was. The presence of witnesses at royal births served crucial legal and political purposes. When a prince or princess was born, questions of legitimacy could determine who inherited thrones, controlled kingdoms, and commanded armies. The witnesses present could later testify that they personally saw the child emerge from the queen's body, that no substitution occurred, that the baby was indeed royal offspring and not some impostor smuggled into the birthing chamber. Medieval and early modern history contains numerous examples of disputed successions where birth witnesses' testimony became crucial evidence. The practice of public royal births thus protected the monarchy by making fraud or deception nearly impossible. Too many eyes watched too closely for any trickery to succeed. But the cost of this political necessity was extraordinary. You watch the Queen labour under the gaze of dozens of strangers, most of them men, many of them with only tenuous connection to the royal household but present because their rank or position entitled them to witness this state event. She has no darkness, no intimacy, no ability to cry out or lose control without an audience observing and likely gossiping about it later. The midwife, often a highly paid royal midwife with an official position, tries to provide what privacy she can, positioning screens or hangings around the bed during examinations, but the essential publicness of the event can't be escaped. The Queen must give birth as a public performance, maintaining dignity while experiencing agony, embodying both majesty and motherhood simultaneously. The rituals surrounding royal births were elaborately choreographed weeks or months in advance. The lying-in chamber would be prepared according to strict protocols, the bed positioned precisely, the hangings arranged in specific ways, the religious objects placed according to rank and precedence. Lists of authorized witnesses would be drawn up by officials, and guards would control access to ensure only approved individuals entered. Messengers stood ready to carry news of the birth to various nobles and foreign courts, their routes and speeches prepared in advance. The entire apparatus of state mobilized around this single bodily event, treating the Queen's labour as a matter of national importance, requiring the same attention as a military campaign or diplomatic treaty. The distinction between royal and common births reveals fascinating tensions in medieval society. Birth was understood as fundamentally natural, something women's bodies did regardless of rank or wealth, a great equalizer that made queens and peasants equal in their pain and danger. Yet the social meaning attached to birth varied enormously by class. A peasant woman might give birth with only her mother or a neighbour present. The event significant to her family but barely noticed beyond her immediate community. A queen's birth, by contrast, became a public spectacle with political ramifications spreading across kingdoms. The same biological process carried entirely different social weight depending on whose body performed it. You notice the royal midwife occupies a more ambiguous position than her common counterpart. She's been appointed by court officials, paid from the royal treasury, expected to follow protocols established by tradition and politics, rather than just medical necessity. If this birth succeeds, she might receive substantial rewards, gifts of money, land, or position. If it fails, especially if the queen dies, she might face investigation, blame, or even punishment. The political stakes transform her medical role into something more perilous, where outcomes she can't entirely control might determine her own fate. Royal midwives were often experienced, skilled practitioners who had proven themselves at noble births before being elevated to royal service. But all the skill in the world couldn't guarantee against the complications that claimed rich and poor mothers alike. Historians still argue about when the practice of witnessed royal births began and how widespread it truly was. Some evidence suggests it became more formalised and extreme in the early modern period, reaching its peak in courts like Versailles, where royal life became utterly public spectacle. Medieval practice might have been somewhat less invasive, but the principle of witnessed births for succession security clearly operated even in earlier centuries. The exact number of witnesses, their positions in the room, and the degree of privacy permitted probably varied by kingdom, ruler, and circumstance. But the fundamental publicness of royal birth as a political event remained constant. The queen you're observing finally delivers her child a son. The court erupts in barely controlled celebration, and officials immediately rush to verify and record every detail. Someone notes the exact time of birth, consulting elaborate astronomical charts because the baby's horoscope will be cast by court astrologers within hours. Another official examines the infant closely, counting fingers and toes, checking for any marks or signs that might carry meaning. A third begins drafting the official announcement, choosing words carefully because this document will be copied and sent to every significant court in Europe. The Queen herself recedes into the background despite having just performed the crucial work she succeeded in her duty by producing an heir. But now the infant becomes the centre of attention while she begins her own recovery in relative obscurity. The baby is immediately taken for baptism. Royal baptisms happened with extreme urgency because an unbaptized heir created succession uncertainty. If the infant died before baptism, theological debates might ensue about the soul's fate, and practical questions would arise about whether an unbaptized child could be considered a legitimate heir who had briefly held the throne before dying. The baptism ceremony itself would be another elaborate public event with prescribed roles for godparents chosen from the highest nobility, with processions and witnesses and documentation creating a paper trail that would follow this child throughout life. The contrast between royal birth theatrics and the merchant's wife's darkened chamber reveals how the same biological event could be culturally constructed in radically different ways. Both births involved pain, danger, midwives, and prayers. Both could end in tragedy despite everyone's best efforts. But one happened in intimate darkness surrounded by supportive women, while the other occurred under bright lights before a crowd of official witnesses. One was primarily a female, domestic event, the other a male witnessed affair of state. One left minimal documentation, the other generated official records, announcements, and diplomatic correspondence. Yet royal mothers paid a price for their exalted position. They endured childbirth stripped of the privacy and female solidarity that made it bearable for common women. They couldn't scream, couldn't lose control, couldn't be weak or fearful without it becoming court gossip. They had to give birth as queens, maintaining royal dignity while their bodies performed work that acknowledged no rank. And after birth, while common mothers might rest in their lying-in period with female relatives, royal mothers often had to resume ceremonial duties quickly, appearing in public, receiving visitors, demonstrating that they'd recovered and could continue their royal functions. The month of rest that protected common women was often shortened or eliminated for royalty, whose bodies belonged not to themselves but to the state. You watch as the witnesses begin to file out, their official duty completed, already discussing what they've seen and considering how to describe it in letters to their own allies and patrons. The Queen remains in her state bed, attended now by ladies-in-waiting and the royal midwife, finally granted some degree of privacy now that the politically necessary portion of the event has concluded. She's survived, produced an heir, fulfilled her primary duty as queen, but at what cost to her dignity, privacy, and sense of self? The magnificent chamber, the rich hangings, the attending nobles, none of these protected her from the fundamental danger of childbirth. Wealth and rank could buy better food, cleaner surroundings, more skilled attendants, but they couldn't eliminate the risk. Queens died in childbirth just as peasant women did, and all the witnesses in the world couldn't prevent it. Back in the merchant's birthing chamber, a sudden change in atmosphere snaps everyone to urgent attention. The baby, swaddled and seemingly healthy moments ago, has stopped breathing. Its face, pink and scrunched seconds before, is turning greyish-blue, and no amount of rubbing or gentle shaking by the panicked gossip holding it seems to revive the infant's breath. The midwife rushes over, her practiced calm barely masking the terror you can see in her eyes. Because she knows what everyone in this room knows, unbaptized babies who die are in spiritual peril, destined for limbo at best, and there's no time to fetch a priest. You're about to witness one of the most extraordinary powers granted to medieval midwives, the authority to perform emergency baptism. A sacramental act that temporarily made these illiterate women holders of priestly power in defiance of the Church's normal restrictions on female religious authority. The midwife doesn't hesitate. She calls for water, any water will do, though blessed water would be better, and someone rushes to bring a cup. Her hands move with practiced speed, sprinkling water on the baby's forehead, while speaking the baptismal formula, "I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." The Latin comes haltingly from her mouth, probably imperfectly pronounced, but the words themselves are what matter. This single act, performed by a woman without any official ordination, without any priest present, in a moment of desperate emergency, carries the full sacramental weight of the Church's most important ritual of initiation. If this baby dies in the next moments, it dies baptized, its soul saved from limbo, admitted to heaven despite its mere minutes of earthly life. The theological implications of this practice were extraordinary and somewhat contradictory. The medieval Church taught that baptism was absolutely essential for salvation without it. Even innocent infants couldn't enter heaven but were consigned to limbo, a state of natural happiness but eternal separation from God. This created urgent pressure to baptize babies quickly after birth, before illness or accident could claim their unbaptized souls. But the Church also taught that women couldn't be priests, couldn't perform sacraments, couldn't wield spiritual authority over men or even over the Church's rituals. Yet here, In emergency circumstances, a woman was permitted indeed, required to perform the Church's most crucial sacrament, creating a strange exception to the normal rules about female religious incapacity. The permission for midwives to perform emergency baptism developed over centuries of practical necessity, clashing with theological principle. Early church fathers had debated whether lay baptism was valid, and under what circumstances. By the high medieval period, church law clearly established that in emergencies, specifically when death seemed imminent and no priest could be summoned in time, any Christian could baptize. Regardless of gender or ordination status, the midwife, as the person most likely to be present when newborns died or emerged in distress, became the practical holder of this emergency authority. Some dioceses required midwives to swear oaths that they knew the proper baptismal formula and would use it when needed, making emergency baptism an official part of the midwife's licensed duties. Historians still argue about how this emergency baptism authority affected medieval women's religious status and midwives' social position. Some scholars see it as a rare crack in the wall of male religious authority, a moment when practical necessity forced the Church to acknowledge female capability in spiritual matters. Others argue it actually reinforced female subordination by framing women's sacramental authority as purely exceptional and emergency-based, never threatening the normal male monopoly on priestly power. The midwife could baptize only when a priest wasn't available, only in life or death circumstances, and her authority evaporated the moment the emergency passed. This emergency exception proved the rule of normal female exclusion from religious authority. You watch as the midwife completes the baptism, making the sign of the cross over the tiny forehead, murmuring additional prayers that aren't technically required but feel necessary in this moment of crisis. And then, whether from the baptism's spiritual power, from the cool water's shock, or simply from spontaneous recovery, the baby gasps, coughs, and begins to breathe again. Its colour returns, changing from grey to pink, and its thin cry fills the chamber with sound that everyone receives as miraculous blessing. The midwife hands the infant back to its mother, with hands that tremble slightly, the only sign of how frightened she was. The crisis has passed, but the baptism stands. This child is now officially Christian, marked with the sacramental seal that will follow it through life and protect its soul at death. But not all such emergencies ended so well. You imagine the countless times medieval midwives performed this same ritual over babies who continued dying despite the holy water, their tiny souls saved but their bodies lost. The midwife's duty in such cases extended beyond the sacramental act itself. She had to comfort grieving parents, arrange for the infant's body to be taken to church for proper burial, and later testify if questions arose about whether the baptism had been performed correctly. If she failed to baptize a dying infant, or if she performed the ritual incorrectly, she might face serious consequences, blame from the family, censure from church authorities, even accusation of having deliberately withheld baptism for evil purposes. The pressure to baptize created some problematic situations that church authorities struggled to regulate. Some midwives allegedly baptized babies who weren't truly in danger, either from overcaution or from desire to demonstrate their authority. Others supposedly performed the ritual incorrectly, mangling the Latin formula or forgetting crucial steps, raising questions about whether such baptisms were valid. More disturbing were rumours difficult to verify but persistent in medieval records of midwives who used the baptismal formula as a kind of magic spell, speaking the words over sick babies or even adults in medical crisis. treating the sacrament as a healing charm rather than a religious rite. The Church tried to regulate these practices through licensing requirements and supervision. But the intimate, emergency nature of birth made effective oversight nearly impossible. The question of premature or doubtful baptism also created theological dilemmas. What if a midwife baptized a baby who seemed to be dying, but the infant recovered and lived for decades? The child was baptized, certainly, but without the full ceremonial context of normal baptism, no godparents chosen, no church procession, no priest officiating, no community witnessing. Some church authorities required such children to undergo a second, conditional baptism ceremony later, with the formula modified to, "If thou art not already baptized, I baptize thee." To avoid the sin of rebaptizing someone who had already received the sacrament, this conditional baptism allowed the community to properly celebrate and witness the child's entry into Christianity, while respecting the validity of the emergency baptism that had already occurred. The broader question of limbo, the fate of unbaptized infants, caused tremendous anxiety in medieval Christianity and drove much of the urgency around emergency baptism. Theological opinion varied on limbo's exact nature. But most authorities agreed that unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven because they carried original sin, yet wouldn't suffer the torments of hell because they had committed no personal sins. Limbo was imagined as a place or state of natural happiness, but without the beatific vision of God pleasant enough, but a tragic waste of a soul that could have achieved salvation if only water and words had been applied in time. This theology, which modern Christianity has largely abandoned or softened, created intense pressure on medieval parents and midwives to ensure every baby received baptism before death claimed it. The emergency baptism scenario you witnessed highlights a fundamental tension in medieval Christianity between its theology of gender and its practical realities. The Church's official teaching held that women were spiritually inferior to men, too weak and corrupt to be trusted with religious authority, unfit to approach the altar or handle holy things. Yet, when it came to the crucial matter of infant salvation, when seconds might separate a soul from limbo, the Church had no choice but to entrust women with sacramental power. The midwife's hands, deemed too impure to consecrate the Eucharist or offer priestly blessing, were pure enough to perform baptism when necessity demanded. This contradiction was managed through framing emergency baptism as exceptional, emergency only, subordinate to normal priestly authority, but the power remained real, exercised by women, saving souls in moments when no man was present or permitted to help. The baby in your arms for the mother has now taken her baptized infant back. Holding it close with tears of relief will carry this emergency baptism throughout life. When asked about their baptism day, most people could point to a church, a priest, a celebration with godparents and community. This child's baptism story will always begin with crisis, with near death, with a midwife's hurried Latin words spoken over failing breath in a darkened chamber. Yet it counts fully, officially, saving the soul as surely as the most elaborate cathedral baptism. The water touched the forehead. The words were spoken. The intention was correct, and in medieval theology, that was enough. God didn't require perfect pronunciation or priestly authority when a soul hung in balance. Even a woman's words, spoken in emergency, could unlock heaven's gates. Hours after the birth, when mother and baby have both stabilized and the immediate crisis has passed, the midwife turns her attention to something that everyone else in the room has been carefully ignoring: the afterbirth. Delivered shortly after the baby and now resting in a basin covered with cloth. You watch as she examines it carefully, turning it over in her hands with an expression of intense concentration, reading it like a text that contains crucial information. The placenta, this strange organ that sustained the baby for 9 months and emerged like a second birth, held profound mystery and significance in medieval understanding. What happened to it, how it looked, and how it was disposed of were all matters of serious concern, wrapped in beliefs that range from medical observation to pure folklore to outright magic. The midwife's examination serves practical purposes first. She checks that the placenta appears complete, with no pieces missing that might have remained inside the mother's body. Retained placental fragments could cause deadly infection or hemorrhage in the days following birth. She notes its size, shape, and colour, looking for abnormalities that might explain any difficulties during labour or predict the child's future health. Medieval medical theory held that the placenta revealed important information about the pregnancy and the child's constitution. A healthy, well-formed placenta suggested a strong baby. A damaged or unusual one might indicate problems ahead. This reading of the afterbirth combined genuine medical observation with interpretive frameworks that modern medicine would reject, creating a practice that was part diagnostic examination, part fortune-telling. But the placenta's significance extended far beyond medical assessment. Medieval people believed this mysterious organ possessed special properties and powers that persisted even after it had served its biological purpose. The placenta occupied a strange categorical position. It had been inside the mother's body, intimately connected to the baby, neither fully self nor fully other. This liminal status made it symbolically powerful and potentially dangerous. What you did with the placenta mattered enormously, according to medieval belief, because improper disposal might harm the child, the mother, or even cause wider misfortune to the household. The protocols for afterbirth disposal varied by region and tradition, but everywhere treated it as requiring careful, ritualized handling rather than casual discarding. The most common disposal method you observe the midwife preparing involves burial. She wraps the placenta carefully in clean linen, handling it with obvious respect, and explains to one of the gossips that it must be buried deep in consecrated ground or in a specific location on the family's property. The burial site mattered. Some traditions held that burying the afterbirth under the threshold of the house would ensure the child always returned home, creating a magical tie between person and place. Others recommended burying it beneath a tree, particularly an apple tree or oak, so the child would grow strong like the tree. Still others insisted on burial in churchyard soil, extending the church's protective blessing to this strange remnant of birth. Historians still argue about how literally people took these locational prescriptions, whether they represented genuine magical thinking or simply customary practices whose original meanings had been half forgotten. Some traditions assigned the father the responsibility of burying the placenta, one of the few active roles men played in the birth process. He would take the wrapped package, perhaps not even knowing exactly what it contained, and enter it according to local custom, performing a ritual that marked his acceptance of the child and his role in protecting it. The act of burial transformed the afterbirth from medical waste into something almost sacred, given proper funeral rites as though it were a being that deserved respectful disposal rather than casual discarding. This treatment reflects medieval Christianity's complex relationship with bodies and bodily products. The Church taught that human bodies were temples of the Holy Spirit, destined for eventual resurrection. And perhaps that sacredness extended even to the temporary organs that sustained prenatal life. But not all placentas were buried. You notice the midwife setting aside a small portion of the afterbirth before wrapping the rest for disposal. And when you inquire, you learn that she intends to dry and preserve this piece for medical use. Dried placenta appeared in numerous medieval remedy recipes, prescribed for various ailments ranging from infertility to epilepsy. The logic was purely sympathetic magic. The placenta had sustained life in the womb, so consuming it might restore life and health to sick bodies. Some recipes called for placenta to be powdered and mixed with wine, others for it to be burned and the ashes taken, still others for it to be worn in a charm bag around the neck. Modern sensibilities find these practices disturbing, but medieval people saw the placenta as a natural source of powerful medicine, no stranger than using herbs or animal parts in healing preparations. The appearance of the placenta also provided material for divination and prophecy. The midwife notes a particular pattern in the blood vessels, a slight irregularity in the membrane, and murmurs something about the child having a lucky temperament. Medieval midwives developed elaborate systems for reading placentas the way later fortune tellers would read tea leaves or palm lines. Every variation in colour, texture, or structure supposedly revealed something about the baby's character, health prospects, or destiny. Some claimed that a placenta examined carefully could reveal whether the child would be brave or cowardly, intelligent or simple, long-lived or short-lived. These predictive claims had no medical basis, but they served social functions, giving anxious parents something concrete to hold on to, translating the abstract uncertainty of a newborn's future into specific, manageable predictions. Certain unusual placental features carried special significance and generated particular anxiety or excitement. A caul, a portion of amniotic membrane covering the baby's face at birth, was considered especially lucky and powerful. Children born with cauls were supposedly protected from drowning, gifted with second sight, or destined for greatness. The caul itself became a valuable charm that families preserved carefully, sometimes keeping it for the child's entire life as a protective talisman. Sailors particularly valued cauls, believing they prevented shipwreck and drowning, and a market existed for purchasing cauls from families willing to sell them. The medieval worldview granted physical objects symbolic powers that seem irrational to modern thinking. But within that framework, a caul was genuinely valuable, worth preserving and even trading. Conversely, certain placental abnormalities provoked fear and suspicion. If the afterbirth looked damaged, discoloured, or malformed, it might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural interference during the pregnancy. Perhaps a witch had cursed the mother, or evil spirits had attacked the developing child, leaving their mark on the placenta. Such interpretations could have tragic consequences if they led to the baby being viewed as tainted or unlucky, potentially facing rejection or even infanticide in extreme cases. The midwife's role included managing these interpretations, either reassuring families that unusual placentas didn't necessarily indicate problems, or in some cases, discreetly disposing of particularly abnormal afterbirths without showing them to the family to avoid provoking superstitious fears. The placenta's dual nature, both waste product to be disposed of and powerful substance requiring careful handling, reflects broader medieval attitudes about the body and its products. Medieval Christianity maintained complicated views about physicality, simultaneously exalting the body as God's creation and denigrating it as a source of sin and corruption. Birth products existed in the intersection of these contradictory attitudes. They were natural, created by God's design, yet also messy, bloody, associated with women's bodies and sexuality, and therefore somewhat shameful and dangerous. The elaborate rituals around placental disposal managed these contradictions, acknowledging the afterbirth significance while also removing it from sight and attention as quickly as possible. Modern anthropologists studying placental practices across cultures have found remarkable similarities to medieval European customs burial. Consumption, preservation, and ritualized disposal appear in traditional societies worldwide, suggesting something deeply human about the impulse to treat the afterbirth as significant rather than dismissing it as mere waste. The medieval practices you're witnessing, for all their strangeness to modern sensibilities, connect to broader patterns of human culture making around birth and the mysterious organs and substances it produces. The midwife completes her examination and wrapping of the placenta, handing it to the father who's been allowed briefly into the chamber now that the birth is complete. He takes the package solemnly, understanding his duty, and departs to perform the burial according to custom. The afterbirth's journey from womb to grave mirrors the larger journey of life itself, emergence, brief existence, and return to earth. In treating it with ritual care, medieval people acknowledge that birth involves not just one body becoming two, but a complex process of separation, transformation, and disposal that required spiritual attention alongside physical management. The second birth, as they call the placenta's delivery, marked the final closure of pregnancy's mysteries, the last step in transforming a woman from pregnant to mother, from containing life to having brought forth life into the separate, complicated world. In the days following the birth, you notice a different midwife arriving at the household, not the birth attendant, but a woman with a reputation for reading signs and interpreting omens. She's been summoned specifically to examine various aspects of the birth for prophetic meaning, because medieval people believed that the circumstances surrounding a child's arrival into the world contained encoded information about that child's entire future. Every detail mattered: the day of the week, the hour of night or day, the position of stars, the ease or difficulty of labour, the baby's appearance, even the sounds heard during delivery. You're about to witness how childbirth became a text to be read, a collection of signs that supposedly reveal destiny, and how this divinatory practice coexisted uneasily with Christian theology's insistence that God alone knew the future. The reader begins with the most basic element, the day of birth. Medieval tradition held that each day of the week carried specific influences and predictions. A Monday child would be fair of face. According to the old rhyme you've heard gossips reciting, Tuesday's child was full of grace. Wednesday's child was full of woe. The particular baby you've been following was born on a Thursday, which the reader announces with satisfaction means the child has far to go, a prediction of travel, adventure, perhaps a life beyond the boundaries of their birthplace. Whether anyone truly believed these day-based prophecies or simply recited them from tradition is difficult to determine. But the rhymes were repeated at countless medieval births, giving parents a framework for imagining their child's future. The hour of birth mattered equally. This baby emerged just after midnight, in what medieval cosmology considered the first hour of the new day, a liminal time when one day surrendered to the next. The reader interprets this as highly favourable beginnings carry special power, and a child born at day's beginning supposedly inherits strength for starting enterprises, initiating projects, and leading others. Conversely, children born at dusk or in the final hours before midnight were sometimes viewed as inheriting endings rather than beginnings. Though interpretations varied by region and reader, the underlying logic was purely sympathetic magic. Qualities of the temporal moment imprinted themselves on the infant, emerging into time at that instant. But the most elaborate prophetic reading comes from examining the baby's body itself for birthmarks, unusual features, or signs that supposedly revealed character and destiny. The reader unwraps the swaddling and conducts a thorough examination. noting a small dark mark on the infant's shoulder. "This birthmark," she announces, "indicates the child will bear burdens, but bear them well, the shoulder being where loads are carried. The mark suggesting this child's destiny involves responsibility and endurance." Another mark near the heart suggests passionate temperament and deep feelings. The specific interpretation seems somewhat arbitrary to you, made up on the spot. But the family listens with intense attention, hungry for any information about this mysterious new person who has joined their household. The baby's appearance at birth provided additional prophetic material. A child born with lots of hair was supposedly destined for wealth, the abundance of hair symbolizing abundance in life. A very small baby might be predicted to grow clever and quick, while a large infant suggested strength and possibly slow thinking. Babies who emerged crying loudly were read as having strong wills and demanding natures, while quiet babies might be gentle or possibly sickly. These interpretations built on observable traits, extrapolating from immediate characteristics to lifetime patterns, creating narratives that parents could use to understand and anticipate their child's development. Historians still argue about how much genuine belief accompanied these birth prophecies. Some scholars suggest they were primarily entertainment, social customs performed because tradition required them, but not taken literally. Others argue that in an age of genuine uncertainty about children's futures, when disease, accident, and social upheaval made survival to adulthood far from guaranteed, people genuinely craved any information, even speculative, about what lay ahead. The prophecies provided comfort and structure, transforming frightening uncertainty into specific predictions that could be prepared for or celebrated. Whether the predictions came true was almost beside the point. They served psychological functions in the present regardless of their accuracy about the future. The Church's position on birth divination was officially hostile but practically tolerant. Theology held that attempting to know the future was sinful presumption, invading God's exclusive knowledge, and potentially involving demonic assistance. Astrology reading the stars for predictions was particularly suspect, because it suggested the heavens controlled human destiny rather than God. Yet birth time and circumstance reading was so widespread and so integrated into common practice that parish priests rarely condemned it unless it became explicitly connected to demon invocation or witchcraft. The line between acceptable tradition and forbidden divination was perpetually negotiated, with most people erring on the side of continuing practices their grandmothers had followed. Astrology provided the most elaborate framework for birth prophecy, though its application required specialized knowledge beyond most midwives' training. Wealthy families might hire actual astrologers to cast the newborn's horoscope, calculating the precise positions of planets and stars at the moment of birth and interpreting their configurations according to complex astrological theory. These horoscopes could be extraordinarily detailed, predicting not just general temperament but specific events: when the person would marry, whether they'd travel, how long they'd live, what occupations suited them. Royal births required horoscope casting as a matter of state importance, with court astrologers producing lengthy documents that would be consulted throughout the child's life when making important decisions. The reader you're observing lacks the education for full astrological calculation, but she incorporates simplified astrological concepts into her reading. She notes that the moon was waxing when the baby was born, growing toward fullness, which she interprets as favourable for growth and increase. Had the moon been waning, she might have predicted challenges or diminishment. The visible stars at the birth hour included bright Venus, which she claims indicates beauty and fortune in love for this child. These astronomical observations blend genuine skywatching with interpretive frameworks that assign meanings to celestial objects based on mythological associations and traditional symbolism. The difficulty of labour itself became prophetic material. This birth, being relatively quick and without major complications, supposedly indicated the child would have an easy life, facing obstacles but overcoming them without excessive struggle. Conversely, prolonged, difficult births were sometimes interpreted as predicting a hard life full of trials, the struggle to be born foreshadowing struggles throughout existence. This interpretive framework could create self-fulfilling prophecies, as children born after difficult labours might be viewed and treated as unlucky or troubled from the start, shaping their experiences in ways that confirmed the prophecy, regardless of its supernatural validity. Even the sounds heard during labour carried prophetic weight in some traditions. If dogs howled during the birth, it might indicate the child would have connection with animals or nature. Thunder during labour was usually considered ominous, suggesting a stormy, turbulent life ahead. Church bells heard at the moment of birth were highly favourable, indicating divine blessing and protection. The reader asks the gossips what they heard during this birth, and they mention a rooster crowing just as the baby emerged, which she interprets as excellent. The cock's crow announcing dawn and new beginnings, suggesting the child will bring renewal or change to their family. The prophecies the reader delivers are ultimately optimistic, as most birth readings tended to be. Parents needed hope and encouragement, not dire warnings about the infant they'd just received. The reading served to welcome the child, to assert its place in the family's future, to begin constructing an identity and narrative for this new person. Whether the specific predictions would prove accurate was less important than the social function the reading performed, marking the birth as significant, investing the child with meaning, giving the family a story to tell about who this baby was and might become. You watch the reader complete her examination and prophecy, accepting payment and good wishes before departing. The family will remember her words, will repeat them as the child grows, will perhaps see them confirmed in whatever the child becomes, not because the prophecies were supernaturally accurate, but because human beings are remarkably skilled at finding patterns and confirmations in ambiguous predictions. The baby, currently concerned only with sleeping and feeding, has been given a destiny, a set of expectations and hopes that will shape how others perceive and respond to them. Medieval birth prophecy, for all its questionable supernatural basis, performed the very real social work of incorporating new humans into communities with stories, meanings, and anticipated futures already partially written in the signs that surrounded their arrival. The atmosphere in the different chamber, several streets away from the successful births you've been observing, is devastatingly different. You find yourself in a room where the candles burn lower, the prayers sound more desperate, and the midwife's face shows the grim knowledge that this birth is going terribly wrong. The mother has been labouring for nearly 2 days now, exhausted beyond endurance, and the baby hasn't progressed despite every intervention the midwife knows. You're about to witness the darkest aspect of medieval childbirth, the moment when hope fails, when death becomes more likely than survival, and when communities struggle to make sense of tragedy through frameworks that often assign blame rather than acknowledging the brutal randomness of medical catastrophe. The midwife has tried everything in her repertoire. She's administered every herbal remedy she knows, positioned the mother in various ways, invoked every saint associated with childbirth, employed charms and relics that worked in previous difficult cases, Nothing has helped. The labour simply isn't progressing, and both mother and baby are weakening. In the modern medical world, this situation would likely result in caesarean section surgical delivery that saves lives routinely. But medieval surgery lacked anaesthesia, antiseptic technique, and blood transfusion, making abdominal surgery almost universally fatal. The operation was performed only after the mother had already died, a desperate attempt to extract a possibly living baby from a dead woman's womb, saving the infant's life and soul even if the mother was beyond help. You watch the husband being summoned, breaking the usual taboo against male presence, because the situation has become so grave that normal rules suspend. The midwife tells him quietly that his wife may not survive, and asks what he wants done if the worst happens. Should she attempt surgical extraction of the baby, the question is brutal, forcing him to contemplate his wife's death and decide whether to literally cut open her corpse for the possibility, not certainty, of saving their child. The husband, ashen-faced, struggles to answer. Medieval men faced impossible choices in these moments, choosing between wife and child, between certain loss and potential double tragedy. The Church's position on this question was clear if the mother died with the baby still inside. Surgical extraction must be attempted if there was any chance the infant lived, because the baby's soul needed saving through baptism. The mother, being an adult, would have received last rites and died in a state of grace. The baby, unbaptized, would be damned to limbo if it died unextracted and unbaptized. Therefore, the baby's spiritual need trumped any squeamishness about cutting into the mother's body. Some medical texts even provided instructions for the procedure, though performing it fell usually to midwives or barber surgeons rather than university-trained physicians, who rarely involved themselves in childbirth at all. But this mother hasn't died yet, and the midwife must decide whether to continue hoping or to begin preparing everyone for the worst. She checks the mother's condition again, pulse weak and rapid, skin grey and clammy, barely responsive. She listens for the baby's heartbeat in the way medieval practitioners understood it, feeling the mother's abdomen for movement, trying to determine if the infant still lived. Without modern monitoring equipment, this assessment was largely guesswork, based on subtle signs that experienced midwives learned to recognize but couldn't reliably interpret. The midwife's face tells you she believes both mother and baby are failing. The gossips present have stopped their earlier encouraging chatter and begun to cry quietly. They know from their own experiences or from attending other births what this progression means. Some of them have lost babies, sisters, friends to childbirth's dangers. The statistics were appalling by modern standards. Perhaps 1 to 2% of births resulted in maternal death, meaning that a woman who had 6 or 7 children faced a cumulative risk that made childbirth one of the leading causes of death for medieval women of a childbearing age. Everyone in this room has witnessed or heard of birth tragedies, and the fear they've carried throughout this labour is crystallising into likelihood. The question of why births failed became a source of tremendous anxiety, and often led to blame-seeking that could have tragic consequences. Medieval people lack the medical knowledge to understand obstructed labour, placental abruption, eclampsia, hemorrhage, or infection in physiological terms. They needed explanations that made sense within their worldview, and those explanations frequently involved supernatural interference or human fault. Had someone cursed the mother? Had she sinned in some way that God was punishing? Had the midwife failed to use the proper remedies or prayers? Had evil spirits overcome the protective measures? These questions circulated whenever births ended in death, and the answers could destroy reputations and lives. Historians still argue about how maternal mortality affected medieval women's psychology and social relationships. Some scholars suggest the constant threat of death in childbirth created a kind of fatalism, an acceptance that bearing children might mean dying. Others argue it generated intense female solidarity, with women supporting each other through shared danger and loss. The practice of writing wills before childbirth became common among women with property. Pragmatic recognition that this might be their last chance to determine what happened to their possessions and children. The normality of birth-death, the way everyone knew someone who died in childbirth, must have created pervasive anxiety that modern people, accustomed to extraordinarily safe birth outcomes, struggle to imagine. Midwives bore particular vulnerability when births went wrong. If a mother or baby died, the midwife might face scrutiny, accusation, or worse. Had she been negligent? Had she used improper techniques? Had she perhaps even caused the death deliberately through witchcraft? The association between midwives and witchcraft grew partly from this dynamic when mysterious deaths occurred in circumstances where midwives wielded power over vulnerable women. Communities sometimes sought scapegoats and found them in the very women who'd tried to help. Witch trial records from later periods show midwives disproportionately represented among the accused, their necessary involvement with birth and death making them convenient targets when communities experienced multiple obstetric tragedies. The mother you're watching stirs and speaks with difficulty, asking for a priest. She knows she's dying, wants last rites, wants to confess and receive communion before death claims her. Someone rushes to fetch the parish priest, who will come quickly. Deathbed calls took priority over almost everything else in medieval parish ministry. The husband kneels by his wife's side, holding her hand, trying to offer comfort while his own face shows devastation. The gossips gather closer, their support now more about witnessing and mourning than encouraging and helping. The chamber that began with hope has become a place of anticipated grief. The priest arrives, bringing the consecrated host and holy oil for extreme unction. He administers the last rites with practiced solemnity, anointing the dying woman, hearing her confession, offering what spiritual comfort he can. The ritual provides structure to the moment, religious framing that contextualizes death within the salvation story, promising that physical death leads to spiritual life in Christ. For the dying woman, if she remains conscious enough to understand, this might bring genuine comfort, assurance that her soul is prepared, that heaven awaits, that this suffering has meaning within God's plan. For those watching, the rites transform random tragedy into religious mystery, making death slightly less senseless by incorporating it into sacred narrative. Shortly after receiving the sacraments, the mother dies. Her breathing simply stops, her body relaxes, and the spark that animated her is gone. The keening begins immediately, the gossips crying out in grief, the husband collapsing beside the bed, the midwife bowing her head in sorrow and perhaps relief that the suffering has finally ended. But the midwife's work isn't finished. She must now perform the caesarean section, attempting to extract the baby before it dies too, if it hasn't already. The priest remains, ready to baptize immediately if the infant emerges alive. The surgical procedure is mercifully quick and performed without your observation, behind screens. But you hear the midwife working and then silence. No baby's cry. When the midwife emerges, her expression tells the story the baby was already dead, probably had been for hours. Both mother and child lost. A double tragedy that will devastate this household and ripple through the community. The bodies will be prepared for burial together, the baby placed in its mother's arms, buried as a unit, reunited in death as they were in life. the funeral will be well attended. Communal mourning for a loss everyone understands could have been their own family's tragedy. You find yourself now in a chamber that would have been unthinkable a century earlier, a wealthy merchant's wife in labour. But instead of only the midwife and female gossips, a man in academic robes stands near the bed. He's not the husband, but a university-trained physician, summoned because this is a difficult labour and the family can afford his substantial fees. The midwife still attends, but you sense tension in the room, an unspoken competition for authority over the birth process. You're witnessing the beginning of a transformation that will take centuries to complete but starts here. In moments like this, the gradual invasion of male medical professionals into the birthing chamber, the slow displacement of female midwives by male physicians, and the conversion of childbirth from a natural female process into a medical event requiring expert male management. The physician has never actually delivered a baby himself. His training consisted entirely of reading classical texts, studying anatomy from books and occasional dissections of corpses, and learning theories of disease based on humoral balance. He possesses no practical experience with living, labouring women, has never felt a cervix dilate or guided an infant's head through the birth canal. Yet his university education grants him social and intellectual authority that the midwife's decades of hands-on experience cannot match. He can read Latin, cite Galen and Hippocrates, explain birth in terms of medical theory. The midwife knows what works but cannot explain why in scholarly language. This difference in explanatory framework, rather than actual competence, will eventually determine who controls childbirth. The physician examines the labouring woman, but with obvious discomfort and through layers of blankets that preserve modesty while severely limiting what he can actually assess. He hasn't been trained to examine women intimately, and social propriety forbids the kind of direct manual examination the midwife routinely performs. Instead, he asks questions, observes external signs, and offers recommendations based on theoretical understanding rather than tactile information. He suggests bleeding the woman to balance her humours, removing blood during a process that often ends in hemorrhage, strikes you as dangerously counterproductive. But humoral theory demands it. The midwife objects quietly, noting that the woman has already lost blood and weakening her further seems unwise. But the physician insists, and his authority carries the day. Historians still argue about what drove this transition from female midwives to male physicians attending births. Economic motives certainly played a role. Childbirth represented a substantial market, and as medicine professionalized, physicians sought to control all medical practice, including the traditionally female domain of midwifery. The development of obstetrical forceps in the 17th century gave male practitioners a technological edge, a tool that midwives were forbidden to use, but that could sometimes save lives in obstructed labours. Social factors mattered too, as medicine became associated with university education, Latin literacy, and scientific knowledge. The empirical, practical knowledge of midwives was increasingly dismissed as ignorant superstition regardless of its effectiveness. Gender ideology fundamentally shaped the transition. The emerging scientific worldview of the early modern period associated masculinity with reason, objectivity, and true knowledge, while femininity was linked to emotion, superstition, and unreliable intuition. Midwifery's basis in practical experience, oral tradition, and female-transmitted knowledge made it vulnerable to dismissal as unscientific. Physicians argued that birth required theoretical understanding, not just practical skill, and that women lacked the intellectual capacity for such understanding. The argument was circular universities excluded women, Then physicians argue that women's lack of university training proved their incompetence to practice medicine. The system excluded women and then used that exclusion as justification for continued exclusion. The midwife in this chamber knows she's witnessing her profession's slow death, though she probably can't articulate it that way. She sees the physician's interventions causing harm. The bleeding weakens the mother. His insistence on keeping her lying down fights gravity. His unfamiliarity with birth's normal progression makes him interpret routine variations as emergencies. Yet she's increasingly powerless to counter his authority. When she suggests alternatives based on her experience, he dismisses her as an ignorant woman whose folk practices have no place in modern medical management. The family, awed by his education and male authority, tends to trust him over her despite her superior practical knowledge. The labour eventually progresses successfully despite rather than because of the physician's interventions, and a healthy baby is born. The physician takes credit, notes his fee in his account book, and departs with his reputation enhanced. He successfully managed a difficult birth where the mere midwife might have failed, or so the story will be told. The midwife cleans up, tends to mother and baby with the practical care that actually matters, and receives her smaller fee without fanfare or credit. This pattern will repeat across thousands of births as physicians slowly colonize childbirth, claiming credit for successful outcomes while blaming midwives for failures. The resistance to male birth attendants came from multiple directions. Many women preferred female attendants for reasons of modesty and comfort. Being examined intimately by male strangers violated deeply held beliefs about proper feminine behaviour. Midwives obviously objected to being displaced from their traditional livelihood. Some male authorities also opposed the change, arguing that birth attendance was inherently immodest for men and might corrupt physicians' morals. But these objections gradually weakened under pressure from physicians' professional organisations, changing ideas about medical expertise, and the genuine appeal of new tools and techniques that physicians claimed would make birth safer. The irony was that physician-attended births often had worse outcomes than midwife-attended ones, at least initially. Physicians' lack of practical experience, their reluctance to perform careful manual examinations, their eagerness to intervene with instruments and procedures, and especially their transmission of puerperal fever from patient to patient before the discovery of antisepsis, all these factors made physician attendance often more dangerous than traditional midwifery. The statistical evidence of worse outcomes was largely ignored or explained away, attributed to physicians being called only for the most difficult cases rather than to their actual practices causing harm. It would take centuries for obstetrics to develop genuine improvements over traditional midwifery. But by then, midwives had been largely displaced, and their knowledge dismissed and forgotten. You watch the physician depart and notice the midwife's expression frustration mixed with resignation. Anger at being superseded combined with weariness from fighting a battle she knows she's losing. She'll continue practicing, attending women who can't afford physicians or who prefer female attendants, but her status will decline as physicians claim the prestige births and as medical licensing laws increasingly restrict midwives' scope of practice. Within a few generations, midwifery will have become either a subordinate medical occupation supervised by physicians, or will have disappeared entirely in favour of exclusively physician-attended births, depending on the country and context. The transformation of childbirth from female-controlled natural process to male-controlled medical procedure represents one of the most significant shifts in women's history, though it happened gradually enough that no single generation fully recognised the magnitude of change. Women lost control over their own body's most fundamental female function, lost the female-only spaces where women's knowledge was transmitted, lost the autonomy that the birthing chamber had represented. Birth became medicalized, pathologized, treated as a disease requiring cure rather than a natural process requiring support. The gains were real eventually. Obstetrics developed genuinely life-saving techniques that reduced maternal and infant mortality dramatically. But the losses were real too, and we're still reckoning with the consequences of that transition, still trying to find balance between medical expertise and women's bodily autonomy, still arguing about how birth should be managed and by whom. The chamber is quiet now, the physician gone, the birth successfully completed despite his interventions. The midwife tends her patient with gentle competence born of long experience, doing the work that actually matters, ensuring the mother is comfortable, the baby is nursing well, the household knows what to expect in the coming days. She is, for this moment, still essential, still valued, still practicing the ancient art of women helping women through birth's passage. But the shadows are lengthening, the future approaching where her skills will be dismissed, her knowledge lost, her profession either subordinated or eliminated in favour of male medical management. The medieval birth practices you've witnessed, the darkened chambers, the holy relics, the protective salt circles, the birthing stools, the female solidarity, the midwives' accumulated wisdom. All of this will gradually disappear, replaced by hospital delivery rooms, male obstetricians, medical instruments, and the assumption that birth requires professional expertise rather than simply support for women's natural capability. Some aspects of this transformation represented genuine progress. Others represented the loss of women's spaces, women's knowledge, women's control over their own body's most fundamental experiences. As you prepare to leave this medieval birthing chamber, you carry with you the knowledge of what was the mysterious, sacred, frightening, communal experience of medieval childbirth, with all its superstitions and solidarities, its dangers and its female wisdom. You've witnessed practices that seem strange to modern eyes, but also glimpsed the care, the devotion, the courage of women facing death to bring life into the world, supported by other women who understood from their own experience what that passage demanded. The rituals, the prayers, the charms, the herbal remedies, the protective circles all were attempts to make bearable and survivable what was genuinely dangerous. To assert human agency and divine protection in the face of mortality's threat, medieval people did the best they could with the knowledge they had, and sometimes their best was remarkably good, sometimes tragically inadequate, but always profoundly human. And now, as the candles burn lower and the household settles into the quiet that follows birth's drama, as the new mother dozes with her infant in her arms and the midwife packs away her tools for another day, another birth, another woman's passage through the ancient gateway of bringing life into the world, you feel the gentle pull toward rest, toward the quiet darkness that welcomes sleep, toward the peaceful conclusion of tonight's journey through history's intimate mysteries. The story draws to a close now, and your mind drifts peacefully through the images you've witnessed, the flickering candlelight on stone walls, the midwife's experienced hands, the prayers murmured in darkened chambers, the newborn's first cry breaking the tension. You've walked through medieval births from beginning to end, from the sealed chamber's preparation through the